For more than a century, a crane has stood somewhere above the rooftops of Barcelona, its thin steel arm resting against the sky as naturally as a bell tower or a chimney. Visitors arriving for the first time sometimes mistake it for a temporary fixture, something that will be gone by their next visit, a detail of scaffolding soon to be cleared away. It never is. Generation after generation, the cranes have belonged to the skyline as much as the spires they helped to raise, so that photographs of the city taken 50 years apart show, in nearly the same place, the same patient machinery reaching upward, only the height and shape of the stone beneath it changed. This is the story of that stone and of the building it has slowly become. Its name is the Sagrada Família, the Basilica of the Holy Family, and it rises in Barcelona, in the region of Catalonia, on ground that was once open farmland at the edge of the old city. It was begun in the year 1878 under the direction of a young architect named Gaudí, and at the time this recording was made, it still had not been declared complete. That single fact, spoken plainly, is worth sitting with for a moment. Cathedrals of the medieval age, Chartres, Cologne, even the long, slow rise of Notre Dame in Paris, took decades to build, sometimes a full century, occasionally longer when wars or plague halted the work and later generations had to relearn the plans of the dead. Those histories are often told as stories of hardship, of interrupted ambition, of masons who began a wall their grandchildren would finish. But even the longest of those medieval builds, when measured, start to finish, rarely exceeded 150 years, and most were shorter. The Sagrada Familia has now stood in construction longer than nearly all of them, longer than the great Gothic naves that once defined what a lifetime's work of stone could mean. It is, by the calendar alone, one of the longest continuous building projects in the history of religious architecture, and it has achieved this not through failure, not through some special curse of delay, but through a set of choices, materials, and interruptions, and what it means to build something meant to outlast its builders. To understand why this building has taken so long, it helps first to simply look at it, or to imagine looking at it, because the Sagrada Familia resists easy description. It does not sit quietly in its surroundings the way a Gothic cathedral sits at the center of a medieval square, holding the town around it in a kind of stone stillness. It seems instead to be still becoming something, its surface is crowded with forms that call to mind branches, honeycomb, dripping wax, seashells, and human figures pressed so deeply into the stone that they seem to be growing out of it rather than carved into it. 18 towers were planned in total, each one representing a figure or a group central to the Christian story: the 12 apostles, the 4 evangelists, the Virgin Mary, and, tallest of all, Jesus Christ at the center, meant to rise higher than any other point in the building, and higher deliberately than any other structure in Barcelona, though never so high as to surpass the hill of Montjuic that watches over the city, because Gaudí believed that no human work should rise above what God had made. That single design decision, the exact height calculated so as to fall just short of the mountain, gives some sense of the mind behind this building. It was not a project measured only in stone and mortar. It was measured against creation itself. The city that received this ambition was, in the final decades of the 19th century, a place remaking itself. Barcelona was growing outward from its old medieval walls into a new grid of wide avenues and orderly blocks, a plan that would come to be called the Eixample, meaning simply the extension. Textile mills had brought new wealth and new crowds. The population was swelling with workers arriving from the countryside, and a rising class of merchants and industrialists wanted a Barcelona that could stand visibly alongside the great capitals of Europe. Into this atmosphere of expansion and civic pride came a modest, privately funded proposal. Church devoted to the Holy Family meant not as a cathedral commissioned by bishops or crowns, but as what was called an expiatory temple, built through the small ongoing donations of the faithful rather than the treasury of church or state. It began under a different architect entirely, a man named Francisco de Paula del Villar, who laid the first stone in a style borrowed comfortably from the Gothic past. Within a year, disagreements over cost and design led Villar to resign, and the commission passed to a 31-year-old architect who had, until then, built almost nothing of note. His name was Antoni Gaudí, and the moment he took charge of that half-begun crypt beneath an open field, the building's entire future changed direction, quietly and forever. What Gaudí inherited was modest, a foundation, a crypt beginning to take shape below ground, and a design in the familiar Gothic revival manner common to churches of the period. He would leave behind, over more than 4 decades of devotion, so total that he eventually lived on the construction site itself, was something the world had not seen before and has arguably not seen since. A building that tried to translate the structural logic of trees, bones and shells directly into stone, using geometry borrowed from nature rather than from the rulebooks of classical or Gothic architecture. He would come to see the building not as a commission to complete within his lifetime, but as an offering one he expected other hands to carry forward long after his own had stopped. He is said to have remarked, when asked whether the slow pace of the work troubled him, that his client, meaning God, was in no hurry. Whether or not those exact words survive intact through the retelling, the sentiment they carry has shaped how every architect since has approached the project, not as a race against a deadline, but as a patient, generational act of devotion, in which slowness was never a flaw to be corrected, but simply the natural rhythm of something built to endure far longer than any single human effort could dictate. This, then, is the question this account will follow, gently, across the length of its telling. Why would a single building take longer to complete than almost any other in the history of religious architecture, and why has that length of time never been understood by those closest to it as failure? The answer touches the soil beneath Barcelona, which resisted the weight of stone in ways the first builders had not expected. It touches the particular chemistry and quarrying of the materials chosen, some found nearby, some carried from distant regions, specifically for the qualities of their color and strength. It touches a civil war that halted the work entirely and destroyed years of Gaudí's own drawings and models, forcing later architects to reconstruct his intentions from fragments, photographs, and memory. It touches the astonishing arrival in the final decades of the 20th century of computer modeling and stone-cutting technology that let engineers realize shapes Gaudí himself could only approximate by hand with plaster, chain, and gravity. And it touches, above all, the quiet fact that a building conceived as an act of faith was never meant to be judged by the ordinary clock of construction schedules and completion dates. It was meant to be judged, if judged at all, by whether it was still worth building, patiently, one generation reaching to hand the next what could not be finished alone. Before this story moves further into the streets of 19th century Barcelona, to the crowded workshop where a young Gaudí first sketched columns meant to lean like tree trunks under their own natural weight, it is worth pausing simply to hold this image. A city built in stone, the color of honey and sand, its rooftops warmed by a low coastal sun, and above them, rising out of scaffolding that has rarely, if ever, come fully down, a cluster of spires still reaching toward a height it has taken longer to achieve than the builders of any medieval cathedral once thought possible. If you find comfort in these long, patient histories of stone and ambition, of buildings raised across centuries by hands that never met one another. You are welcome to stay with this channel for more such stories, gathered slowly, the way the structures themselves were gathered, one careful piece at a time. The story of the Sagrada Familia begins not with Gaudí himself, but with the city that made room for his imagination, a Barcelona hungry for identity, expanding beyond its old walls, uncertain yet proud of what it might become, and it is, to that city and to the currents moving through it in the final years of the 1800s, that this account now gently turns. By the middle of the 19th century, Barcelona had outgrown itself in every sense that mattered. For hundreds of years, the city had lived pressed inside its medieval walls, its streets narrow and crowded, its buildings stacked close against one another, as though huddling for warmth. But the old boundaries could no longer hold what the city had become. Textile mills had risen along the rivers and the coastline, their chimneys marking the skyline where church towers once stood alone. Steam power had arrived from England and taken root in Catalonia more thoroughly than almost anywhere else on the Iberian Peninsula, and with it came a new class of manufacturers, merchants, and financiers who looked at their crowded ancient city and saw not charm but constraint. The population had swollen far beyond what the old walls could reasonably contain, and disease and overcrowding had become the grim companions of prosperity. Something had to give, and in 1854, the walls themselves finally did. They were pulled down stone by stone, opening the city to the plain that stretched beyond it. And into that open plain came one of the great acts of urban planning in 19th century Europe. The engineer entrusted with imagining what might fill that empty space was a man named Ildefons Sagrada, and the plan he drew became known as the Eixample, a Catalan word that means simply the extension or the widening. It was a grid of wide, orderly streets crossing at broad intersections, their corners deliberately chamfered so that carriages and later trams could turn without difficulty, and light and air could reach every facade equally. It was a plan built on the conviction that a city's health and a city's dignity were the same project, that ventilation and sunlight were not luxuries for the wealthy, but rights owed to every resident regardless of station. It was, in its way, a democratic geometry, laid across the old plain outside Barcelona's gates, and into its still-forming blocks moved the ambitions of a rapidly modernizing society. Apartment buildings rose along its new avenues. Gardens were planted where planners had insisted upon them, though commercial pressure would later crowd many of those green spaces away. And amid this vast expansion of brick and iron and paving stone, there remained space, both literal and cultural, for something else to grow alongside the factories and the ledgers, a renewed sense of what it meant, in this particular corner of Spain, to be Catalan. This was the era of what would come to be called the Renaissance, the Catalan Renaissance, a slow reawakening of language, literature, and cultural pride that had simmered through decades of political suppression and centralizing pressure from Madrid. Catalan, the language of the streets and the countryside, was being reclaimed as a language of poetry and public life. Old medieval songs and legal codes were rediscovered and republished. A regional identity that had never truly vanished was rising again into visibility, carried by a growing middle class that had the means, for the first time in generations, to fund its own cultural institutions, its own newspapers. It was a moment when industrial wealth and cultural memory were braiding themselves together, each lending the other legitimacy, each searching for monuments through which to express what this city and this people believed themselves to be. Into this atmosphere, proud, anxious, industrious, devout, the idea of a great new church first took shape, though not among architects or civic planners, but among a modest religious association with no ambition at the outset toward anything resembling grandeur. The association called itself the Josephines, formerly the Spiritual Association of Devotees of St. Joseph, founded in the early 1860s by a bookseller named Josep Maria Boccabella. Boccabella was a man of quiet, fervent piety, deeply troubled by what he and others of his circle perceived as the moral drift of the age, the slow erosion, as they saw it, of religious devotion under the pressures of industrial materialism and the anti-clerical currents sweeping through Spanish political life. The Josephines were devoted to Saint Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, whom they regarded as a model of humility, labor, and quiet faith, virtues that seemed to Boccabella increasingly endangered in a city rushing so quickly towards secular modernity. The association grew slowly through the 1860s and 70s, gathering members through prayer circles and modest publications, but its ambitions eventually grew beyond devotion alone. Boccabella began to dream, as he later described it, of raising a temple, not merely a parish church for a neighborhood congregation, but something larger, something meant to atone. The word that recurs again and again in the association's own early language is expiatory. This was to be a temple of expiation, built not through public taxation or diocesan mandate, but entirely through the voluntary donations of the faithful, a sacrifice given freely rather than compelled, intended as a kind of collective penance for what its founders saw as the sins of a modernizing. It was devotional in the truest sense, meant to atone before God for the moral drift of Barcelona and of Spain more broadly, but it was never devotional alone. Even in its earliest conception, the project carried a civic charge as well, for a temple raised entirely by small donations, built stone by stone through the patient generosity of ordinary believers, was also, inevitably, a statement about the character of the city that could produce such generosity. Faith and civic pride were never fully separable in the founding of this project. To build the temple was to prove something about Barcelona's soul, even as it sought to cleanse it. This double motive, atonement intertwined with a quiet insistence on civic worth, would remain woven into the structure for the entire length of its construction, long after Boccabella himself was gone. Land was purchased on the eastern edge of the growing Eixample, a modest plot far from the Cathedral quarter, in a district that was still more promise than reality, surrounded by half-finished streets and open ground. And having secured the land, the Josephines turned, as any such association would, to an architect. Their choice fell upon Francisco de Paula del Villar y Lozano, a respected diocesan architect already known in Catalonia for his church restorations and his fluency in the Gothic revival style that was fashionable across much of devout Europe at the time. Villar was not a radical. He was a careful, competent practitioner of the neo-Gothic idiom, the same general architectural language that was producing restored cathedrals and new parish churches across France, England, and Germany in those decades, a style understood by the pious as appropriately solemn, historically legitimate. His design for the expiatory temple, drawn up in the late 1870s, reflected exactly this sensibility. It called for a modest crypt-level church, built in a restrained neo-Gothic manner, with pointed arches and a relatively conventional plan, the kind of building that would have looked entirely at home among the churches already dotting Catalonia's older towns. It was meant to be dignified, familiar, and achievable, a building whose ambitions matched the humble means of the small donations that were expected to fund it. Construction on Villar's design began in March of 1882, with a modest ceremony marking the laying of the first stone, attended by the Bishop of Barcelona and a small gathering of the Josephine faithful. The crypt began to rise slowly beneath the ground, its neo-Gothic vaulting taking shape one course of stone at a time, exactly as such projects had always taken shape across Catholic Europe. There was nothing in these early months to suggest that the building underway would become anything other than what it had been designed to be: respectable, familiar, unremarkable in its ambitions. One more devout addition to a city already full of churches. And yet, within roughly a year of that quiet ceremony, a disagreement arose between Villar and Boccabella, the details of which survive only in fragments, and later recollection, a dispute, it seems, over the choice of stone for the crypt's columns, touching on questions of authority and vision that a simple stone dispute could not fully explain. Whatever its precise cause, the disagreement proved sufficient for Villar to withdraw from the project altogether in 1883, leaving the crypt half-built and the association once again without an architect. It was at this juncture, according to several accounts that have passed into the project's own institutional memory, that Boccabella recalled a young man he had encountered some time before, an architect not yet 40 years old, still relatively early in his career, known within Barcelona's small architectural circles for a restless, unconventional imagination that some found brilliant and others found simply strange. He had trained at the city's provincial school of architecture, had absorbed, and then begun to depart from the fashionable historical styles of his teachers, and had already produced a handful of buildings around Barcelona that hinted at something unusual taking shape in his mind, a willingness to bend materials and forms in ways that his contemporaries were not yet attempting. Boccabella is said to have felt, on first meeting this young architect years earlier, an impression he could not entirely explain, a sense that here was someone destined for something larger than the modest commissions of the moment. Now, with Villa gone and the crypt waiting unfinished beneath the Aixample's open ground, that earlier impression returned to him, and the name he considered was Antoni Gaudí. Nothing dramatic marked the transition. There was no public announcement of a new vision, no unveiling of grand ambitions to replace the humble neo-Gothic plan already begun. Yet, there was only a quiet handing over of responsibility, a young architect stepping into a half-built crypt that another man had designed, carrying with him, though no one could yet have known it, the seeds of something the city of Barcelona, and indeed the wider world of architecture, had not yet imagined. The man who arrived at the crypt that year was not yet 40, though the accounts that survive describe someone who already seemed to belong to an earlier century, dressed with peculiar plainness, given to long silences broken by sudden bursts of conviction. He had been born in the town of Reus in the region of Catalonia, the son of a coppersmith, and he would later say, though the sources disagree on the exact wording, that his understanding of form and volume had come first from watching his father hammer flat sheets of metal into curved vessels, learning by hand what could not be learned from a drawing. Whether the story is precisely as he told it, or softened by later retelling, it points towards something true about the man. He trusted the object more than the plan, the model more than the paper, the built thing more than the idea of it. He had studied architecture in Barcelona, graduating in 1878, and the director of his school is said to have remarked, upon handing him his diploma, that he did not know whether he had just given the title of architect to a genius or to a madman. Time would answer that question slowly, and only partially, for even at the end of his life, there were those who used both words to describe him, without contradiction. Before Sagrada Família, Gaudí had already built a small number of works around Barcelona, and beyond that, hinted at the temperament that would later define the temple. There was a house for a tile manufacturer, its ceramic surfaces and iron gates already showing an unwillingness to repeat the ornamental vocabulary of the past. There was work on a modest chapel and a summer residence, projects that allowed him room to experiment with brick vaulting and with structural ideas borrowed, in his own quiet way, from the natural forms he observed constantly around him. He had also begun a long association with the Gaudi family, whose patriarch, Eusebi Gaudi, a textile industrialist with wide interests and a deep sympathy for Catalan culture, would become his most steady patron across the decades. It was through the reputation earned in these years, modest in scale but unmistakable in character, that his name reached the small board of the Josephine Association, responsible for the temple then rising, however slowly, on the eastern edge of the Ixample. The circumstances of his appointment in 1883 were plain rather than dramatic, as the closing note before this passage has already suggested. Francisco de Paula del Villar, the original architect, had resigned after disagreements over the choice of stone for the crypt's columns, a dispute recorded by later historians as more a matter of professional pride than of engineering necessity, though the details of the disagreement are not preserved with certainty. Villar's departure left an unfinished crypt beneath an open field, its walls rising only a few meters from the ground, its Gothic revival style already settled in the lower courses of stone. The board needed a replacement who could continue the work without delay, and Gaudí, then 31 years old, was recommended by some accounts through the engineer Joan Martorell, who had supervised Gaudí's early career and who vouched for the younger man's competence to the board members reviewing candidates. There was no search for a visionary. There was only a practical need to keep a modest neighborhood church moving forward and a young architect willing to take on a commission that promised steady, if unspectacular, work. What happened instead in the years that followed was a transformation that neither the board nor Gaudí himself could have fully anticipated at the moment of his appointment. He began, as any careful architect would, by continuing what Villar had started, respecting the existing foundations and the crypt walls already laid. But almost immediately, according to the records of his early notebooks and the recollections of those who worked alongside him, he began to reconsider the building's ultimate form. The neo-Gothic style that Villar had chosen, drawing on the medieval cathedrals of northern Europe with their ribbed vaults and flying buttresses, represented, to Gaudí's eye, a borrowed language, a style perfected by other cultures for other skies and other stone. He wanted something that grew instead from Catalonia itself, from its light, its coastline, its long relationship with the sea and the mountains behind it. He wanted, too, something that did not merely imitate the structural logic of Gothic building, but replaced it with a logic drawn more directly from the forms he saw in the natural world, forms that carried their own loads, without the crutch of an external buttress, forms shaped by growth rather than by geometry imposed from without. This shift did not arrive as a single declaration. It arrived gradually, season by season, as Gaudí's confidence in his patron's trust deepened and as his own convictions clarified through the slow work of building. He began introducing forms borrowed from trees, their trunks branching upward into vaults, the way a trunk branches into limbs, distributing weight along curved paths rather than straight ones. He studied the spirals of shells, the structure of bones, the way a leaf's veins carried support without waste, and he began translating these studies, patiently and without hurry, into the stone of the temple rising above him. Later engineers and historians who examined his surviving models would find again and again echoes of these natural studies embedded directly into the structural logic of the building, not as ornament laid over a conventional frame, but as the frame itself, reconceived. It was this reconception, more than any single decorative flourish, that separated Sagrada Familia from the neo-Gothic churches being built elsewhere in Europe during the same decades. And it was this reconception that would occupy Gaudí. His devotion to the project deepened as the years advanced, in a manner that those who knew him described with a mixture of admiration and concern. He took on other commissions in these early years, the apartment buildings and parks that would later make his name known across the world. But even as those projects consumed his attention, the temple remained, in his own words, as recorded by contemporaries, the great work toward which everything else was preparation. As the decades passed and his other commissions concluded or slowed, he withdrew from them one by one until by the final years of his life the temple was nearly all that remained of his practice, occupying his days almost entirely, a devotion that some biographers have described in terms close to religious vocation rather than professional commitment. He is said to have moved his residence in his last years into a small workshop on the temple grounds itself, sleeping there among the models and drawings, rather than in his own home across the city, though the precise dates of this move are not agreed upon by every source. The method by which he worked, meanwhile, departed as sharply from convention as the forms he sought to create. Where earlier architects had relied primarily on paper drawings, elevations, and sections worked out mathematically before construction began, Gaudí distrusted flat drawings as a complete means of capturing three-dimensional structural behavior. He turned instead to physical models, built in plaster and often suspended upside down, using networks of string weighted with small sandbags, a technique that allowed the natural pull of gravity to trace out the correct curve for an arch or vault before a single stone was set. Photographs of these hanging models, when inverted through mirrors or later photography, reveal the exact catenary curves the finished structure would follow, curves that distributed compressive force efficiently through the stone without requiring external buttressing of the kind Villa's neo-Gothic design had assumed necessary. This was not merely an artistic preference. It was for Gaudí a form of experimental engineering conducted patiently over months and years, refined through repeated adjustment of string length and weight until the model itself seemed to settle into the one form that gravity would allow without strain. Alongside these hanging models, Gaudí built countless plaster studies of individual elements: columns tilted at angles derived from the branching patterns of trees, capitals shaped like the joints where a branch met a trunk, window openings whose curves echoed the outlines of flowers or shells he had gathered and studied on his own time. Workers and assistants who passed through his workshop during these years described a process closer to sculpture than to conventional architectural drafting, one carried out with endless patience, one model altered and reconsidered dozens of times before Gaudí judged its form satisfactory enough to guide the masons below. It was a method that consumed enormous time, far more than a conventional set of drawings might have required. And it was a method that would later complicate the project's continuation after his death, when the physical models themselves, damaged and scattered in later years, became the primary surviving record of decisions Gaudí had never fully committed to paper. But in these earlier decades, as the crypt gave way slowly to rising walls and the first hints of the towers that would come to define the temple's silhouette, this patient, experimental, almost devotional method of working was simply how the building came to be, stone by stone, model by model, string by hanging string, under the quiet and increasingly singular attention of the young architect who had arrived, almost by accident, to finish another man's church. The method that Gaudí brought to the temple did not arrive fully formed. It grew, as so much of his work would grow, from long observation and slower experimentation, from a conviction that had been settling in him for years, before he ever set foot inside the unfinished crypt of the Sagrada Família. He had come to believe, with a quiet certainty that colleagues found either inspired or faintly troubling, that the architecture of the great Gothic cathedrals, for all their soaring beauty, had been built upon a kind of structural apology. The flying buttress, that great external rib of stone, bracing the walls of Chartres or Rennes or Cologne, was not, to Gaudí's eye, a triumph of engineering so much as a confession of failure, an admission that the walls themselves could not stand without help, that the pure line of the building had to be propped from outside, like a tired traveler leaning on a staff. He wanted a church that needed no such staff. He wanted the forces of gravity and thrust to resolve themselves entirely within the stone, so that nothing extraneous clung to the exterior, so that the building stood the way a tree stands, or the way a human skeleton stands, balanced from within. To find that balance, he turned not to calculation alone, but to a method so simple it seemed almost like a child's experiment, and yet so precise in its consequences that it would occupy him, on and off, for years. He suspended small chains and weighted cords from a board mounted above his workshop, allowing them to hang freely under their own weight. Then let gravity draw each strand into the shape it wanted to take, a shape that mathematicians would later recognize as the catenary curve, the same graceful sag that a rope makes between two posts. When such a hanging chain was photographed and the image inverted, turned upside down, the curve of tension became a curve of compression, a perfect arch that carried its load purely along its own length, with no outward thrust needing to be caught by a buttress. Gaudí built elaborate hanging models of string and small weighted sacks, sometimes representing entire sections of the building at once, and studied their inverted photographs as a sculptor might study a completed cast, reading in the sagging threads the future lines of stone columns and vaults. It was, in its way, a form of architectural humility, a refusal to impose a shape on the building from the outside, and instead a willingness to let the forces already present in the world reveal the shape the building was asking to take. From these hanging studies came the second great structural principle that would define the temple, the hyperboloid form, a warped surface generated not by arbitrary curves, but by straight lines, rotated around an axis, producing shapes that looked organic and fluid. Gaudí found in the hyperboloid a way to build vaults and openings that let light pass through in shifting, branching patterns, and he found in the related paraboloid a means of shaping ceilings that seemed to bloom outward like the underside of a great stone flower. These were not decorative flourishes applied after the structural problem had been solved. They were the structural solution itself, discovered through models and adjusted patiently as the hanging chains were reweighted, rephotographed, and reconsidered. Underlying all of this was a philosophy that Gaudí returned to often enough, in conversations recorded by those who worked beside him, that it came to be treated almost as his personal creed, that nature was the greatest architect there had ever been, and that anyone who wished to build well needed only to look closely enough at what already grew and stood and endured in the natural world. He had spent long hours as a younger man walking in the countryside outside Barcelona, observing the way tree trunks divided into branches at precisely the angles needed to carry their own weight, without splitting, the way bones thickened at the joints where stress concentrated, the way a stalk of wheat could bend in wind without breaking because its structure tapered and flexed exactly where it needed to. He carried these observations directly into the temple's columns, designing them not as the straight, uniform verticals of a conventional colonnade, but as leaning, branching forms that tilted at calculated angles before splitting into secondary branches near their tops, echoing the geometry of a forest canopy. Visitors walking beneath the completed portions of the nave in later decades would often say, without needing much prompting, that the interior felt like walking through a grove of stone trees, and this was not a poetic accident. It was the direct, deliberate consequence of Gaudí's conviction that a column which leaned to meet its load, the way a trunk leans to meet the combined pull of wind and gravity, was stronger and truer than a column standing in rigid, artificial verticality. Around this structural philosophy, Gaudí built a symbolic program for the temple that was as carefully considered as the engineering itself, though it spoke in the language of scripture and devotion rather than statics and load paths. The building would be entered and understood, he decided, through three great facades, each dedicated to a different chapter in the story that the temple was meant to tell. The Nativity facade, facing the rising sun to the east, would celebrate birth and beginning, carved with a profusion of natural imagery, animals, plants, and figures drawn from the account of Christ's birth, rendered in a style so dense and organic that visitors often described it as looking almost as though it had grown rather than been carved. The Passion façade, facing the setting sun to the west, would tell a starker and more sorrowful story, the suffering and death that followed the joy of the Nativity, and Gaudí intended it from the beginning to be rendered in a harsher, more angular style, so that the architecture itself would carry the emotional weight of the narrative before a single figure was even examined. The third façade, the Glory façade, facing south, was conceived as the grandest and most important of the three, representing humanity's path toward God, the final judgment and the glory of eternal life, and Gaudí spoke of it, according to those who recorded his words, so that the temple would be experienced as a journey rather than a single static image. The ambition folded into this three-part program was from the very outset almost unreasonably large. Gaudí did not design a parish church scaled to the modest congregation that had originally commissioned it. He designed a building meant to hold thousands of worshippers at once, with a soaring central tower dedicated to Jesus Christ intended to rise higher than any other point in the structure, surrounded by a constellation of further towers representing the 12 apostles, the 4 evangelists. Each tower conceived not merely as an ornament, but as a symbol given physical height and mass. The scale was not chosen for spectacle alone. Gaudí believed that a building meant to draw the eye and the spirit upward, toward the divine, needed genuinely to climb, needed towers that pierced the sky over Barcelona in a way that no citizen glancing up from the street could mistake for anything ordinary. He spoke, in remarks preserved by those who assisted him, of wanting the temple to be a kind of stone Bible, legible even to those who could not read, so that its structure and its symbolism reinforced one another at every scale, from the overall silhouette of the towers down to the smallest carved leaf on the Nativity façade. Such an audacious design, unlike anything being built elsewhere in Europe at the time, did not arrive without resistance. Among Barcelona's architectural establishment, and among some members of the clergy overseeing the temple's construction, there was genuine unease about a design that abandoned so thoroughly the familiar Gothic and Romanesque vocabularies. Some considered the hanging chain models eccentric, even faintly absurd, a curious private obsession rather than a serious engineering method, and questioned whether a building derived from such techniques could ever truly stand. Others worried about cost and timeline, sensing correctly, though perhaps not to the full extent that history would prove, that a design of this complexity would take generations rather than years to complete. And yet, alongside this doubt, there grew, gradually, a current of genuine admiration, particularly among younger architects and artists in Barcelona who recognized in Gaudí's work something that broke entirely from convention, while remaining unmistakably reverent. Bishop Josep Torres i Bages, an early and influential supporter of the project, saw in Gaudí's design a fitting expression of Catalan identity and Catholic faith intertwined, and lent the architect's ambitions the ecclesiastical weight they needed to continue. It was this uneasy but productive mixture of skepticism and belief, doubt from some quarters and quiet conviction from others, that allowed Gaudí's design, radical as it was, to take root rather than be abandoned, and to begin its long, slow translation from hanging string and inverted photograph into stone, begin to climb toward the sky Gaudí had always intended it to reach. Before any of that climb could begin, there was the ground. The ground asked for a patience that had nothing to do with vision or symbolism or the interplay of light through a rose window not yet drawn. It asked only to be understood, tested, and, where it proved unworthy, corrected, and this work, unglamorous and largely invisible to anyone who would later stand in the nave and look upward, occupied the earliest years of the temple's life, eager as it is to reach the towers and the facades and the moments that photograph well. But no tower stands without a foundation beneath it, and no soaring nave holds its shape without something patient and unseen doing the harder, duller work of simply not failing, season after season, beneath the visible church. The plot chosen for the temple sat within the Axample, that great grid of new streets Ildefonso had drawn across the fields north of the old city, a district still being filled in during these years, its blocks not yet uniformly built up, its grounds still carrying something of the character of the plain it had recently been. This was not raw, untouched land in the way a rural building site might have been. It had been farmland crossed by irrigation channels, low-lying, close enough to the sea and to the old riverbeds that ran down from the hills that its subsoil held water at shallow depth and shifted in composition from one corner of the plot to another. Any structure raised here would need to reckon with clay and sand and gravel arranged in inconsistent layers, none of them a single dependable bed of rock, such as a builder might dream of finding as he sank his first trial shafts. This was, in other words, ordinary urban ground, unremarkable in appearance and unremarkable in the annals of construction difficulty when compared with sites chosen for other great churches across Europe. But it was the ground on which an unusually ambitious weight would eventually be asked to rest, and that combination, ordinary soil beneath extraordinary intention, was what gave the foundations of the Sagrada Família their quiet significance. Gaudí, arriving as he did into a project already begun, inherited not a blank site, but a beginning already committed to the earth. Villa's crypt had been started before Gaudí ever walked the grounds, sunk according to a conventional neo-Gothic plan, its outline traced and its lower courses laid, according to methods that were standard for churches of that era, methods that assumed, as most church builders of the 19th century assumed, a structure of moderate height. Buttressed in the expected manner, its downward forces distributed in ways well understood by engineers trained in the schools of the previous generation. The crypt as begun was not designed with towers of unprecedented height in mind, because no one, including Villa himself, had yet imagined that this particular building would eventually reach for a summit taller than nearly anything else the city would produce. It was a foundation suited to a temple, certainly, but a temple of a more restrained and legible ambition than the one Gaudí would later draw. This left the young architect with a peculiar inheritance. He could not simply erase what had already been sunk into the ground. The crypt's outline was fixed, its walls rising, however modestly, from the excavation already made. What he could do, and what he did with the same patient, exacting attention he would later bring to every other part of the building, was study what existed below and adapt his design so that the parts of the temple not yet begun could grow outward and upward from that inherited base without betraying it, and without asking that inherited base to bear a weight it had never been built to carry. This required him to think carefully, plot by plot and pier by pier, about where the greatest loads of his eventual building would fall, and to reinforce, extend, or entirely re-engineer the foundation in those places, so that the ground beneath them could accept towers whose height had no real precedent in the church architecture of the region. It is worth pausing on how unusual this problem was for an architect of Gaudí's temperament. He was, throughout his working life, a designer who thought in terms of forces made visible, who wanted the stone itself to show the path along which weight traveled from roof to floor to earth, and this instinct extended naturally downward into the ground itself, into a domain that most architects of his day treated as a purely technical matter to be resolved by engineers and left unconsidered by the artist. Gaudí did not divide the labor so neatly. He understood, long before he had drawn a single window of the nave, that a temple intended to rise as high as he intended his to rise could not be indifferent to what lay beneath it, and that any failure of imagination in the foundation would eventually announce itself as a failure of the entire structure above. However beautifully that structure had been conceived, the engineering caution this demanded expressed itself in several ways, some visible in the records that survive and some inferred by later engineers who studied the building's lower courses once the technology existed to examine them properly. Test borings were taken across the site to establish, as precisely as the instruments of the age allowed, the depth and character of the layers beneath, distinguishing firmer strata from softer ones, mapping where the underlying gravel lay closer to the surface and where clay persisted to a troubling depth. Where the soil proved weaker, deeper and broader foundations were called for beneath the piers destined to carry the greatest loads, particularly those that would eventually support the central towers, whose combined weight, once conceived at the scale Gaudí intended, would be unlike anything the site's original planners had imagined resting upon it. This was slow work by its very nature, work that produced no image worth admiring, no elevation worth sketching for a patron's approval, only trenches, shafts, and the patient recording of what the ground gave up when probed. There was no glamour in it, and it drew no crowds of onlookers curious to see what marvel was rising in their neighborhood. Because, for a long while, nothing was rising at all. There was only the crypt's low walls emerging gradually from the excavation, ringed by scaffolding. Worked upon by masons whose task in these years was not to create beauty, but to create certainty, horse by course, that what came later would not settle unevenly, crack or lean, as so many ambitious buildings before it had done when their builders' confidence in the visible outpaced their attention to the invisible. Gaudí's caution here reflected something that ran through his entire career, a refusal to let ambition outrun preparation. He was, by nature and training, unwilling to gamble the eventual height of his towers against an uncertain footing below, and this unwillingness expressed itself in the deliberate, unhurried pace with which the foundation and crypt were completed and reinforced before any of the temple's more famous elements, the nativity façade among them, were permitted to rise in earnest above ground level. It would have been possible, in principle, to rush this stage, to trust that ordinary foundations would suffice and correct problems as they arose. And certainly other buildings of the era were raised in exactly that spirit of confident haste. But the Sagrada Familia's foundation work proceeded instead at the pace the ground itself seemed to demand, tested and adjusted, deepened where deepening was needed, so that the weight of a design not yet fully drawn could nonetheless be anticipated and provided for in advance. There is something worth dwelling on in this order of operations, the fact that the most consequential decisions determining whether the temple would stand for a century or crack within a generation were made not in the drawing of the spires, which is what most visitors and most photographs would eventually celebrate, but in this early, hidden labor beneath the crypt, decisions recorded in surveyors' notes and structural calculations, rather than in the elegant catenary models for which Gaudí would later become famous. The public imagination, then as now, gravitates toward the visible marvel, toward stone lace and soaring towers and windows that scatter colored light across a nave, and rightly finds wonder there. But the patient work of understanding a plot of ordinary axe-sample soil, of testing its capacity, of reinforcing what a previous architect had begun without full knowledge of what would eventually be asked of it, deserves its own quiet recognition, because without it, none of the visible wonder that followed would have had anywhere honest to stand. It is worth remembering, too, that Gaudí did not have the luxury of demolishing and beginning again. He worked, in these years, as an inheritor as much as an originator, taking Villa's crypt as a given condition of his practice and finding within its constraints the room to secure a foundation equal to ambitions Villa himself had never entertained. This required not merely engineering skill, but a particular kind of humility, a willingness to work backward from what already existed in the earth toward what might yet be built above it, adjusting his emerging vision to accommodate a beginning he had not chosen, and adjusting the ground itself where necessary. And so, before the eye could ever be given cause to marvel, before a single spire pierced the Barcelona sky, or a single façade told its story in carved stone, there was this: trenches opened and studied, borings taken and recorded, a crypt's walls reinforced course by course against a future weight not yet visible even in Gaudí's own drawings. And a young architect learning, in the least celebrated part of his life's great work, that everything the world would someday admire depended entirely on what he was willing to secure first, in the patient, unglamorous dark beneath the ground. What rose from that secured ground did not rise from nothing. It rose, stone by stone, from a landscape that Gaudí knew with the intimacy of a man who had walked its hills before he had ever drawn a single line for the temple that would consume him. The mountain of Montjuic, standing at the edge of Barcelona like a patient grey shoulder turned toward the sea, gave up much of the sandstone that would become the temple's early walls. Quarrymen there had been cutting stone for the city's buildings for generations before Gaudí ever arrived with his particular demands, and the material they offered was known, trusted, and already woven into the fabric of Barcelona itself in facades and foundations across the growing city. But Gaudí did not simply accept what was offered. He asked questions that quarry masters were not accustomed to hearing. He wanted to know how the stone weathered under rain that came in from the sea, how it held its color across a season, how it resisted the slow chemical work of time and salt air upon its surface. He tested samples, watched them through months and years, and he came, eventually, to draw not only from Montjuic, but from other quarries scattered across Catalonia, each chosen for a particular hue, a particular hardness, a particular way of catching the light at the hour when the sun fell low over the plain. Stone from Garraf, stone from the hills further inland, each variety offering its own pale gold or warm grey or faint rose, so that the temple's surfaces would not present a single uniform mass, but a living variation, the way a hillside itself never shows one colour but many, changing with distance and hour and weather. This attentiveness to material was not, for Gaudí, a matter of decoration alone. He had come to believe in the years since his early training that a building's stone should behave as living rock behaves in nature, bearing weight the way a tree bears its own limbs, or a bone bears the frame of a body. The choice of stone, then, was never separate from the great structural questions that occupied him. A column that leaned according to the mathematics he had derived from hanging chains needed a stone capable of enduring compression at odd, unfamiliar angles no ordinary church had ever asked its material to hold. Durability was not a luxury but a necessity built into the very geometry of the design, and so the search for the right quarry was, in its own quiet way, as consequential as any calculation drawn at his table. But stone alone could not tell Gaudí what his forms would look like before they existed. For this, he turned to another material entirely, one far humbler in appearance and far stranger in its use: plaster. It was in plaster that the temple was first permitted to become fully three-dimensional before it was ever permitted to become permanent. Gaudí built models, some small enough to hold in two hands, and others large enough to fill a workshop, hanging from wires and threaded lines when the calculation demanded it, as with his famous inverted studies of chains weighted with small bags of shot, from which the true, gravity-tested curve of an arch could be read directly by turning the photograph or the model itself upside down. From these studies, plaster casts emerged, some rendered at full architectural scale, so that a mason or a stonecutter could stand before a section of the temple's future facade in solid, tactile form before ever touching the actual stone that would replace it. The geometry Gaudí pursued, his ruled surfaces, his hyperboloids and helicoids and paraboloids, forms borrowed not from the traditions of church building, but from the language of nature's own structures, of shells and horns and branching trees. A drawing could lie by omission, could hide the way a curve twisted through space in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Plaster could not lie in the same way. It held its shape, and it could be walked around, touched, corrected, and touched again. Workshops filled over the years with these models, some broken deliberately by falling debris during the difficult years the temple would later endure, and painstakingly reconstructed afterward from photographs and surviving fragments by those who came after Gaudí and understood how essential these plaster forms were to any faithful continuation of his work. Without them, the geometry Gaudí carried largely in his own mind, and in the private notation of his drawings might have been lost entirely. With them, it became possible, decades later, for entirely new generations of architects and masons to trace plastercast by plastercast the logic of forms that no other church in Europe had ever attempted. Stone and plaster carried the temple through its first decades, through the years of Gaudí's own direct hand upon the work. But no material, however well chosen, could remain unchanged forever. And as the 20th century advanced, and as the building slowly climbed higher and demanded structural answers that traditional stone construction alone could not easily provide, a new material entered the temple's long life: reinforced concrete. New material. It was not a material Gaudí himself invented or introduced wholesale, but he had already begun, in the later years of his active work, to explore its possibilities, understanding that concrete, strengthened internally with steel, could achieve spans and heights that solid stone, however carefully cut, would strain to achieve alone. It was a bridge, in every sense, between his own era of masons and stonecutters, working largely as their medieval predecessors had, and the coming century of engineers who would need to raise towers taller than anything Gaudí had drawn in his lifetime, towers whose internal structure would owe as much to modern calculation, gentler geometry of chains and gravity. This shift did not happen without difficulty. Later, architects and engineers working from Gaudí's surviving models and notes after his death faced the delicate task of introducing modern materials into a design conceived largely in the language of traditional stone construction, and doing so in a way that did not betray the forms he had spent so many years discovering. Reinforced concrete allowed the towers to rise with a strength and slenderness that pure stone construction might never have permitted at such heights, and it allowed builders working generations after Gaudí's death to press forward toward completion using methods he himself had only begun to glimpse. In this way, the temple's material history became, quietly, a history of the 20th century's own engineering advances, folded invisibly inside forms that still, from a distance, appeared to belong entirely to an older world of stone and mortar. Yet stone and concrete alone could never have given the temple its particular texture, the quality that made visitors, upon first stepping close, sense that they were looking not merely at architecture, but at something closer to a living surface. That texture came from ironwork, forged in nearby workshops, wrought into railings and gates and lamps, whose curling forms echoed the branching organic language of the building itself. It came from ceramics, glazed and fired, in colors drawn again from the Catalan landscape, the blues of the coast, the greens of inland hills, the warm ochres of dry summer fields, pressed into mosaic and set along the temple's pinnacles and towers, catching sunlight in fragments that shifted with the hour and the season. Broken tile, deliberately shattered and reassembled into new patterns, a technique already familiar from Gaudí's earlier work across Barcelona, found its way onto the temple's highest points, so that from below, the towers seemed to shimmer faintly, their surfaces alive with small, brilliant pieces catching and releasing light as clouds passed overhead. Each of these materials, considered together, told a quiet, consistent story. The stone came from the mountains and quarries of Catalonia itself. The clay for the ceramics was drawn from the same regional earth. Even the iron, worked by hands trained in workshops scattered through Barcelona and its surrounding towns, carried something of the character of the place that had shaped it, Mayors. The temple in this sense was never simply built upon Catalan ground. It was built in a very real material way from that ground itself, lifted stone by stone and tile by tile from the hills and quarries and clay beds of the region, and reassembled high above the city into forms that echoed deliberately the very landscape from which they had come. Gaudí had often said that his inspiration lay not in the architecture of past cathedrals, but in the structures of nature itself, in trees and bones and shells, and it was fitting then that the substance of his temple should come so directly from the natural world surrounding Barcelona, so that the building might be said to have grown almost as much as it had been constructed, a slow accumulation of earth and stone drawn upward patiently into shapes that no quarry or clay bed had ever imagined for itself, but which they now, together, quietly sustained. On the eastern side of the rising temple, facing the direction of the sunrise and the streets that led down toward the sea, the nativity facade began, stone by stone, to take on its final form. Of the three great facades Gaudí envisioned for his church, this would be the only one he lived to see substantially finished, and in later years, when the building's fate hung uncertain and its future uncertain still further, this facade would stand as the clearest surviving record of what its architect had truly intended. Document written not in paper or ink, but in carved granite and basalt, meant to outlast any drawing that might be lost or any memory that might fade. The work proceeded slowly as Gaudí wished it to. He was not a man in a hurry, and he often remarked, according to those who worked closest beside him, that a building intended to stand for centuries need not be completed within a single lifetime, and that haste was, in matters of sacred architecture, a kind of disrespect toward the patience the work deserved. The Nativity facade would occupy the better part of 3 decades of his attention, rising gradually from its base as funds allowed, and as Gaudí's own understanding of the forms he sought continued to deepen and change. Visitors to the site during these years often remarked on how little the facade seemed to change from one visit to the next, and yet, over spans of months and years, the transformation was profound. The stone accumulating detail, the way a coral reef accumulates its structure, imperceptibly in any single moment, undeniably across the span of seasons. What emerged from this slow accumulation was unlike anything that had been carved onto the face of a European cathedral before. Gaudí divided the facade into 3 great portals, each dedicated to one of the virtues he associated with the Sacred Family: faith, hope, and charity, and around and above these portals he filled every available surface with carved life. There were angels playing instruments, their wings folded or spread, according to the postures Gaudí had studied and sketched. There were shepherds and kings, their robes carved with a heaviness and texture meant to suggest real fabric, caught in real wind. There were animals rendered with a precision that startled visitors accustomed to the stylized, almost symbolic beasts of older church carvings. Doves with individually articulated feathers, a rooster with its comb rendered in careful relief, a tortoise bearing, according to Gaudí's design, one of the great columns of the portal upon its shell, a quiet echo of the architect's conviction that the structures of the natural world could themselves serve as models for the structures of stone. Plants, too, filled the facade in an abundance that had no precedent in the cathedrals that came before. Palm leaves, wheat sheaves, cypress trees, and climbing ivy wound through the carved scenes, not as decorative borders framing a central narrative, but as active participants within it, growing up through the same stone that held the human and angelic figures, blurring the line between architecture and vegetation. Ponto, a stone garden, climbing toward the sky alongside its towers. Gaudí was known to send workshop assistants out into the countryside surrounding Barcelona to gather specimens, actual branches, actual leaves, actual flowers, which were then cast in plaster and used as direct models for the stonecutters, so that the carved cypress on the façade's central portal might trace its form back to a living tree that had once stood in a garden or a field beyond the city's edge. This insistence on naturalistic accuracy extended, in ways that struck many of Gaudí's contemporaries as unusual, even by the standards of his already unusual practice, to the human figures populating the façade as well. Rather than rely on inherited conventions for how a shepherd or a king or an angel ought to appear, Gaudí arranged for local residents to serve as models, their faces and postures cast in plaster to be studied and, in some cases, translated with only modest alteration into the finished stone. According to accounts that survive from those who worked in the temple's small on-site workshop during these years, models were selected not for any theatrical or idealized beauty, but for the particular qualities of expression or bearing that Gaudí sought for a given figure. An older man's weathered hands to serve as a study for one of the shepherds, a young mother and infant to inform the tenderness Gaudí wanted for the scenes surrounding the Nativity itself. Yet, more unusual still, and more widely discussed by those who documented the temple's construction in later decades, was Gaudí's reported use of casts taken from deceased infants and stillborn children, obtained with the cooperation of local hospitals. One in his effort to render with total anatomical honesty the carved figures of the infants appearing throughout the nativity scenes. The historical record on the precise extent and nature of this practice remains incomplete, and the sources that touch on it do not agree in every particular, but the broader pattern they describe is consistent. An architect for whom no degree of naturalistic accuracy was too demanding to pursue, and a workshop willing, under his direction, to go to considerable and sometimes somber lengths in service of that accuracy. Animals, too, were reportedly cast directly, their forms taken from creatures brought to the workshop specifically for that purpose, so that the carved doves and the carved rooster and the carved tortoise might carry within their stone surfaces something of the actual anatomy of the living originals they were meant to represent. The workshop itself, situated within the temple grounds and expanded gradually as the project's needs grew, became during these years a small and particular world of its own, populated by sculptors and stonecutters and apprentices who worked, by most accounts, under conditions that were exacting but not unkind. Gaudí was known to move between the drafting tables and the stone benches with a directness that left little room for ambiguity about what he wanted, examining a half-finished carving with the same close attention he brought to a structural calculation and correcting where he judged correction necessary. With plaster models, he shaped himself. His own hands pressed into the material to demonstrate a curve or a fold or a gesture he found the stonecutter had not yet captured. Several of the sculptors who worked under him in these years, men whose names survive in the temple's own records, though they remain largely unknown outside them, would spend decades of their working lives on this single facade, their skills developing alongside the project itself, so that the later carvings on the facade show, to those who study them closely, a confidence and fluency the earlier sections do not yet possess. Apprentices too passed through the workshop during these decades, some remaining only briefly and others staying on to become skilled stonecutters themselves, and the accounts that survive of the workshop's daily rhythm describe a place where the pace of the work, while demanding, was never rushed in the manner of a commercial construction site working against a deadline, There was no deadline in the ordinary sense. Funds arrived irregularly, drawn from donations that fluctuated with the fortunes of the city and its people, and the construction advanced only as far as those funds allowed, a circumstance that might have frustrated an architect less temperamentally suited to patience, but which Gaudí, by most accounts, regarded without particular anxiety, treating the uneven pace of funding almost as a natural condition of the work, no different in principle from waiting for stone to be quarried or plaster to cure. This unhurried tempo, born partly of necessity and partly of Gaudí's own temperament, meant that the Nativity façade rose across a span of decades rather than years, its lower portions largely complete by the early years of the new century, while its upper reaches, its pinnacles, and its four slender bell towers continued to develop and refine themselves for years afterward. Visitors who returned to the site after long absences described a peculiar sensation of recognizing the façade and yet finding it subtly changed. A new figure emerged here, a previously bare surface now dense with carved wheat or grapes there. The whole surface continuing its slow accretion of detail in a manner that seemed to defy the ordinary experience of watching a building being built. It was less like watching construction, several remarked, and more like watching a very slow and very patient form of growth, the stone accumulating its final texture, the way lichen might accumulate across the face of an older, undecorated wall, or the way a tree might add, ring by ring, the record of years to its trunk. By the time Gaudí's own attention had turned fully toward the temple in these years, abandoning nearly every other commission to devote himself entirely to the church, the Nativity façade had become something close to a complete statement of his intentions. Carved catalogue of birth and growth and natural abundance standing in stone at the eastern edge of a building that would, in the decades following his death, continue to rise according to principles he had established but would not himself see fully realized. The façade remained, and remains still, a record of a particular collaboration between an architect's exacting vision and the patient, careful hands of the sculptors and apprentices who translated that vision, plaster cast by plaster cast, into the enduring granite and basalt of the temple's eastern face. There came a point, difficult to mark with any single date, but visible in the slow withdrawal of his attention from other work, when Antoni Gaudí ceased to be an architect who also built a temple and became, instead, a man who built a temple and, incidentally, had once been an architect of other things. The commissions that had filled his earlier decades, the townhouses along the Passeig de Gràcia, the undulating stone façade of the building, the people of Barcelona had already begun calling by an affectionate nickname for its quarried, wave-like face. The wrought iron and shattered tile of the park commissioned by his patron on the hill above the city, these gradually fell away, not through any dramatic renunciation, but through a quieter and more absolute redirection of hours. By the middle of the 1910s, according to the accounts of those who worked alongside him, Gaudí had all but stopped accepting new work. Temple, which had once been one project among several, had become the only project, and the years that remained to him were given to it with an intensity that those who knew him described as total. This was not, it seems, an easy transition to characterize even for those who witnessed it, because Gaudí had never been a man to separate his labor from his belief. The devout Catholicism that had shaped his understanding of the temple's purpose from his earliest involvement with the project had, over the decades, deepened into something that colleagues and biographers alike have called ascetic, a word that in his case was not metaphorical. As his focus narrowed to the Sagrada Família alone, so too did the scope of his daily life. He gave up, by degrees, the modest comforts he had once allowed himself. He fasted with a regularity that concerned his friends. He walked, rather than rode through the streets of Barcelona to attend Mass, a habit that would prove consequential in ways no one could have anticipated. And in his final years, according to the accounts that survive, He began sleeping, not in his own residence, but within the workshop built on the temple grounds itself. A modest room among the plaster models and drafting tables where the work of the church was made, so that the boundary between his life and his labor dissolved almost entirely. He had become, in the description offered by more than one who observed him in this period, something closer to a hermit dedicated to a single unfinished work than an architect in the conventional sense of the profession. The temple that consumed him in this way was, throughout these years and for long afterward, a project sustained by a method of financing that set it apart from nearly every other great church raised in the history of European building. The Sagrada Familia had never drawn on the treasury of a monarch, nor on the accumulated wealth of a diocese, nor on the taxation powers of a state eager to display its grandeur through stone. It had begun, as the earlier history of the project makes clear, as the initiative of a private religious association, and it continued, through Gaudí's decades of involvement and beyond them, to rely almost entirely on the voluntary generosity of individuals, the small offerings of parishioners. The larger, but still modest gifts of Barcelona's merchants and professional classes, the collection boxes placed at the temple's gates for the coins of visitors who came to see a church that seemed from certain angles only half born out of its own scaffolding. This manner of funding meant that construction moved not according to any fixed schedule dictated by an underwriting body, but according to the unpredictable rhythm of donation, a rhythm that could slow to a trickle in years of economic hardship and swell modestly in years of civic goodwill, but that never once approached the steady, guaranteed flow of funds available to a cathedral raised under royal or ecclesiastical command. Gaudí understood this reliance on donation, not as a limitation to be quietly endured, but as a condition of the work that required his direct and active participation. He became, in his later years, something of a public solicitor for his own temple, a role that sat uneasily alongside the reclusive habits of his private life, but that he nonetheless took up with evident seriousness. He gave interviews to the newspapers of Barcelona in which he spoke of the temple's progress and its needs. He walked on his frequent journeys through the city in the distinctive and increasingly threadbare clothing that had once caused acquaintances to mistake him, according to more than one account, for a beggar rather than the most celebrated architect in Catalonia, a detail that his admirers have sometimes treated as evidence of eccentricity, and that his more sympathetic biographers have understood instead as a genuine indifference to appearance that mirrored his indifference to any comfort. He met with wealthy patrons individually in the quiet, persistent manner of a man asking not for himself, but for a cause he considered greater than any personal reputation. He is recorded as having said, in various forms across these years, that the temple was not his to hurry, that Providence would provide the means and the time the work required, and that his own task was simply to continue laboring so long as strength and donation both allowed it. This patient, almost fatalistic approach to the project's uncertain funding did not mean that Gaudí was passive in seeking support. He organized appeals. He allowed his own name and growing reputation, already considerable by the 1910s and 1920s, to be used in the modest publicity efforts of the religious association overseeing the temple's construction. He accepted when circumstances required it. The indignity of asking directly for money on behalf of a building that would not be finished, he knew even then, within his own lifetime, or likely within the lifetimes of anyone then living. The towers of the Nativity façade, the first portion of the exterior to reach anything like completion, had required decades of exactly this kind of patient, uneven fundraising. And Gaudí understood by his later years that the remainder of the temple, the Passion façade, he had not yet begun in earnest. The glory façade that existed only in his imagination and in a handful of sketches, the great central tower dedicated to Christ, that would, in his design, rise higher than any of the others, would require the same slow accumulation of gifts, sustained across a span of time he could not himself hope to witness. It was this awareness, perhaps, that lent his final years their particular quality of quiet urgency. A man laboring not toward a personal completion he might see, but toward the establishment of principles, models, and plaster studies detailed and durable enough that others could continue the work correctly after he was gone. He devoted enormous care in this period to the construction of scale models and to the geometric systems, the hyperbolic paraboloids, the ruled surfaces, the branching columns modeled after trees, that he hoped would allow future builders to extend his vision without requiring his direct hand at every stage. He was, in effect, preparing an inheritance of method rather than an inheritance of finished stone, understanding that the temple's completion, whenever it came, would depend on the fidelity with which others carried his intentions forward. That inheritance arrived sooner than anyone could have wished, and in a manner that none had foreseen. On the 7th of June in 1926, while walking his familiar route toward the church of St. Philip Neri for evening prayer, Gaudí was struck by a passing tram. According to the accounts that survive, his plain and worn clothing, combined with the absence of any identification that might have marked him as a man of consequence, led those who found him to mistake him for an indigent stranger. And he was taken initially to a hospital that treated the city's poor, rather than to a facility where his identity and injuries might have received more immediate and specialized attention. By the time he was recognized, by a chaplain according to the accounts, who noticed something familiar in his face, offers of transfer to better care came too late to matter, and Gaudí, by then too gravely injured to be moved, remained where he had been brought. He died 3 days later, on the 10th of June, at the age of 73. He left behind him a temple that stood, at the moment of his death, still substantially unfinished. The nativity façade, on which he had lavished so many years of care, was largely complete in its lower portions, though its towers still awaited their final ornamentation. The crypt beneath the apse, begun long before his involvement and completed early in his tenure, stood finished and in quiet use. But the naves that would one day rise into forested columns of stone had barely begun to climb above their foundations. The Passion façade existed only as a rough outline and a handful of studies, and the central towers that would come, in time, to define the silhouette of the entire building, nothing more than lines on paper and shapes in plaster, waiting for hands other than his own to give them form. The death of the architect left the workshop in a silence that no one on the site had prepared for. For more than 4 decades, the temple had grown under a single, restless intelligence, one that revised its own drawings almost as quickly as it made them, that trusted plaster and wire and hanging chains more than paper, and that carried within itself 1,000 unspoken decisions about proportion and light that had never been written down because they had never needed to be. Gaudí had been the memory of the project as much as its designer. When that memory was gone, what remained was a construction site full of half-finished stone, a workshop full of broken and unbroken models, and a small circle of assistants who had absorbed, through years of proximity, only fragments of a vision that had lived most fully in one man's mind. The question that settled over Barcelona in the weeks after his burial was not whether the work should continue. Money continued to arrive, however slowly, and the nativity façade stood as proof that the design could be built, but how such continuation could be faithful to intentions that had rarely been fixed in a form anyone else could fully read. In the years immediately following, the work proceeded cautiously under men who had served as his collaborators, following the drawings and models that survived, and relying, where records failed, on their own memory of conversations held on scaffolding or in the modest workshop beside the site. Progress was slow, as it had always been, dependent on donations that rose and fell with the fortunes of the city and the country. But it was progress guided by people who had at least stood beside Gaudí as he worked, who had heard him describe a column, and who carried forward that vocabulary, even without the man who had coined it. It was an uneasy but functioning continuity, the kind of institutional memory that can survive the loss of a founder so long as enough of the people who learned directly from him remain in place to pass on what they absorbed. That fragile continuity would soon be tested by something far more destructive than the simple passage of time. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War reached Barcelona, and with it came a wave of anti-clerical violence that swept through churches and religious institutions across the region. The temple, still under construction and closely associated with the church its architect had served so devotedly, became a target. Militants entered the site and the workshop that stood beside it, and in the chaos that followed, a significant portion of what Gaudí had left behind was destroyed. Plaster models that had taken years to build and adjust were smashed. Drawings, technical studies, and the funicular models. Those inverted structures of string and weighted sacks that had allowed Gaudí to calculate the curves of his arches and vaults through the patient logic of hanging chains were damaged or lost outright. Some accounts described fires set within the workshop. Others described the deliberate breaking of models that had stood for decades as the only physical record of decisions never committed to paper. The precise extent of what was lost has never been established with full certainty, and the surviving accounts do not agree on every detail of what burned, what was smashed, and what was merely scattered and later recovered in pieces. What is certain, because the physical evidence still exists in museum storage and in photographs taken afterward, is that a great deal was destroyed, and that what remained of Gaudí's design intentions for large portions of the unbuilt temple survived only in broken fragments, shards of plaster that had once formed a coherent whole, torn pages that preserved parts of drawings whose fuller versions were gone. For the people who came after, this destruction transformed the nature of the task in ways that went beyond simple delay. Continuing the temple no longer meant following a clear, if demanding, set of instructions left by its designer. It meant, in many places, attempting to reconstruct those instructions from evidence that was partial, damaged, and sometimes contradictory. Architects and craftsmen who took up the work in the decades after the war found themselves engaged in something closer to a slow act of restoration than straightforward construction, piecing together broken plaster casts to recover the geometry of a column capital. Cross-referencing surviving photographs against fragments of models to infer the curve of a vault that no longer existed in any single complete form, and relying on the testimony of the aging craftsmen who had worked directly under Gaudí, and who could sometimes recall a detail that no surviving document preserved. This labor was necessarily painstaking, proceeding one fragment at a time, and it required a particular kind of patience, an acceptance that certainty about the master's exact intentions might never be fully recoverable for every part of the building, and that the best available reconstruction, however carefully assembled, would always carry some trace of interpretation layered over the original. Among those who guided this work forward across the following decades, several names recur in the records of the temple's continuation. Francesc Quintana, who had trained under Gaudí and understood something of his working methods from direct experience, took on responsibility for the site in the years after the war and worked to stabilize both the physical construction and the surviving archive of models and drawings, overseeing early efforts to catalogue and restore what had survived the destruction of the workshop. The work of tending to the broken plaster fragments, sorting them, matching them, and beginning the long process of understanding what shapes they had once formed, fell in large part to craftsmen who worked alongside these architects, their names less often recorded, but their patience no less essential to what would eventually be recovered. In the later decades of the 20th century, Gaudí Benet, whose own father had worked directly under Gaudí on the temple in its earlier years, took up the role of chief architect and carried the project through a long period in which construction methods themselves began to change, bringing computer-assisted design into conversation with the plaster models and hanging chains that had defined the original process. Under his direction, and that of those who worked alongside him, the towers that Gaudí had left as lines on paper began finally to take physical shape, built according to reconstructed calculations that attempted as faithfully as the surviving evidence allowed to honor the geometric logic the architect had established, even where his specific final decisions for those towers had not survived in complete form. Each successive architect who took responsibility for the temple inherited not only an unfinished building, but an unresolved question, one that has never fully disappeared from discussions of the project even in its most recent decades. To continue the design faithfully required decisions in places where fidelity itself could not be simply and mechanically applied, because the original intentions were not always available to be followed. Where a model survived intact, the path was reasonably clear. Where a model existed only in fragments or in a photograph taken from a single angle, or in the recollection of an assistant decades after the fact, faithfulness became a matter of informed judgment rather than direct transcription, an attempt to build what Gaudí would most plausibly have built, given the principles he was known to have followed, rather than a certain reproduction of a decision he had definitely made. This distinction has never been trivial, and it has occasioned real and ongoing debate among architects, historians, and critics of the temple, some of whom have argued that later editions, however carefully reasoned, inevitably introduce the sensibility of their own era and their own architects, and cannot be said to represent Gaudí's design in any pure sense. Others have countered that Gaudí himself never worked toward a single fixed final form, that his own design continually evolved through the decades of his involvement, and that a project of this nature was from its origins one that would always require interpretation by those who carried it forward, since no architect, however gifted, designs a building of this scale and ambition down to its final detail before a single stone is set. This tension between faithful continuation and necessary reinterpretation has not been resolved so much as absorbed into the ongoing life of the project itself. It surfaces in academic conferences devoted to the temple's history, in the careful language used by the foundation that oversees construction when describing which elements rest on surviving Gaudí documentation and which rest on later scholarly reconstruction, and in the quieter, stone by stone, how far their own judgment may reasonably extend before it ceases to serve the vision they were entrusted to continue. What is not in dispute is that the temple did continue through war and its long aftermath, through the slow recovery of fragments and the equally slow accumulation of donations carried forward by successive generations who accepted an unusual kind of inheritance, not a finished plan to execute, but a partial one to complete as faithfully as fragmentary evidence considered judgment would allow. On the western side of the temple, facing away from the sun in a manner Gaudí himself had specified, so that the scenes carved there might be read in a harsher, more oblique light than the eastern façade received. The account of the temple's later decades turns to a different kind of decision and a different kind of hand. The Passion façade had been left, at the time of the architect's death, as little more than a set of intentions, a few sketches, a plaster model damaged and later destroyed in the disturbances of the war, and Gaudí's own repeated remarks, recorded by those who worked alongside him, that this face of the building should shock rather than soothe, that it should be built in his words, as later generations understood them, to appear as though hewn with axes, harsh and bare, so that the suffering it depicted would not be softened by beauty. It was into this sparse inheritance that the sculptor Josep Maria Subirachs stepped in the late 1980s. Invited by the temple's architects to undertake the carving of scenes that no complete drawing had ever fixed in detail. And it is from this decision, calmly documented in the temple's own records and in the extensive commentary it provoked, that the 10th chapter of the Sagrada Familia's long construction proceeds. Subirachs was, by the time of his invitation, already an established figure in Catalan sculpture, known for a style that owed little to the flowing, organic forms Gaudí had made the signature of the eastern façade. Where the nativity front curved and bulged with the soft abundance of leaves, animals and rounded human figures, seeming almost to have grown rather than been built, Subirachs worked in planes and angles, in figures reduced to their essential geometry, stripped of ornament, their surfaces left deliberately unpolished so that the chisel's own marks remained visible in the finished stone. It was, by his own account and by the near-unanimous observation of critics who wrote about the commission at the time, a conscious rejection of imitation. Subirachs did not attempt to carve as Gaudí might have carved. He carved as himself, working from the same governing instructions, the axe-hewn harshness, the intended severity, but arriving at a visual language that shared almost nothing with the façade standing opposite it across the width of the nave. The contrast, once the scenes began to take shape across the 1890s into the surface of the Western Front, was immediate and, to many observers, difficult to reconcile. Figures rendered as flat, angular masses stood where visitors expected the rounded, naturalistic forms familiar from the nativity side. Roman soldiers guarding Christ's tomb, carved as blocky, near-mechanical presences, seemed to some critics to belong to an entirely different building, executed in an entirely different century of sculptural thought. And, indeed, the comparison drawn most often in the press of the period was, to the modernist and even brutalist tendencies then current in European public sculpture, tendencies that had little historical relationship to the Catalan Art Nouveau sensibility, where the nativity façade invited the eye to wander and discover, tucked among its carved foliage, a chameleon, a tortoise, a nest of sparrows, small delights rewarding, patient-looking. The Passion façade offered no such invitation. Its forms were legible from a distance, stark and immediate. Intended, as Subirachs himself explained in interviews given during the years of the commission, to communicate suffering and sacrifice without the mediation of beauty, so that the visitor's first response would be discomfort rather than admiration. This intention provoked almost from the moment the earliest completed groups were unveiled, a public debate that extended well beyond the ordinarily narrow circles of architectural criticism. Letters to Catalan newspapers, recorded in the temple's own archive of press coverage, from the period ranged from admiration for the sculptor's independence to open accusations of desecration, the charge most frequently made being that Subirachs had imposed a personal artistic vision onto a building that belonged, by every reasonable measure, to another man entirely, a man who had died more than 60 years before. Ground was broken on this particular section of the façade. Professional architects, several of whom had trained in the shadow of Gaudí's own disciples and considered themselves custodians of an authentic Gaudí tradition, argued in published statements that the stark angularity Subirachs brought to the Western Front represented not a continuation of the architect's vision, but a rupture with it. A substitution of one artist's sensibility for another's, under the cover of an unfinished commission that could not answer for itself. Others, including some members of the temple's own technical team, defended the choice on the grounds that Gaudí's instructions had explicitly called for harshness and shock, qualities that a modern sculptor working in a modern idiom might in fact deliver more faithfully than an attempt at pastiche. A careful imitation of a dead man's hand that would itself have constituted a kind of dishonesty papering over the absence of genuine instruction with a counterfeit continuity. The debate was never fully resolved and the temple's own published position on the matter has remained, through the decades since, a calm acknowledgement that the Passion facade represents an interpretation rather than a recovery. An attempt to serve Gaudi's stated intentions using the tools and sensibilities available to a sculptor working 3 generations after those intentions were first voiced. This is not, the temple's records make clear, a claim that Subirach's work is what Gaudí would have built. It is a narrower and more modest claim that the work fulfills the functional and symbolic instructions left behind as faithfully as an artist of conscience, working without a complete model to copy, was able to manage. Subirach himself, in remarks given late in his long involvement with the project, which continued until his death in the early years of the following century, expressed no illusion that he had recreated Gaudí. He described his task instead as a kind of translation, rendering into his own sculptural language a set of scenes whose content, betrayal, scourging, crucifixion, burial, was fixed by gospel narrative rather than by any drawing, and whose emotional register had been specified by Gaudí's words, even where its visual form had not. The scenes themselves, arranged across 3 great doorways beneath a bare, sloping roofline, stripped of the towers and finials that crowd the eastern front, proceed in a sequence read, according to the temple's own guidance to visitors, in a serpentine path from lower left to upper right, beginning with the Last Supper and moving through Judas's betrayal, marked by Subirach's stark rendering of a numerical grid whose 16 numbers sum in every direction, to the number of years attributed to Christ's life, a detail admired even by critics otherwise unconvinced by the sculptor's broader style. Through the flagellation, the crown of thorns, Peter's denial rendered beside 3 crowing cocks. The confrontation before Pilate, the road to Calvary bearing a self-portrait of Subirach among the crowd of onlookers, a gesture the temple's records note without further comment, and finally, the crucifixion itself, the Roman soldier's spear, the descent from the cross, and the burial, each group carved in the same flattened angular planes, each figure reduced to gesture and mass rather than anatomical detail, so that the overall effect, as visitors moving along the western approach have long reported, is less a gallery of individually admired sculptures than a single continuous frieze of accumulating grief, its harshness increasing as the sequence climbs toward the crucifixion group at its center. Whether this effect succeeds as Gaudí might have wished remains, even now, a question the temple's own literature declines to settle definitively, offering instead a kind of patient neutrality, noting that visitor reception has itself been divided in ways that mirror the original critical debate. Some finding in the façade's severity a genuinely moving meditation on suffering rendered without sentimentality, others finding it simply incongruous beside the exuberance of the nativity front, a jarring note in what they had expected to be a unified composition. The temple's engineers and current architects, in public statements given over the years since the façade's substantial completion, have tended to frame the matter not as a question with a correct answer, but as an honest illustration of the difficulty inherent in completing any long unfinished work of this kind. More than almost any other structure of comparable scale has been forced to confront directly and repeatedly a building begun by one mind, continued by many hands over more than a century, inevitably accumulates within its stones the marks of successive ages and sensibilities, and the question of how much a structure may change in the process of its own completion while still remaining a single unified vision rather than a sequence of loosely related additions, is not a question the temple's own record claims to have resolved. It is presented instead with the same measured patience that characterizes the temple's approach to its many other open questions of cost, chronology, and original intention, as a tension the building itself now carries permanently within its 2 principal facades, one grown outward in curves and abundance, both claiming descent from the same unfinished instructions, both accepted by the temple's continuing custodians as legitimate, though differing answers to an inheritance that was never going to admit of a single uncontested completion. By the final decades of the 20th century, the temple had entered a new relationship with time, one shaped less by the patient hand tools of the 19th century than by machines that Gaudí himself could never have imagined, though the forms they now served to realize had been imagined by him in full. The change did not arrive suddenly. It arrived the way most changes arrived at the Sagrada Familia, quietly, through the accumulated decisions of successive teams of architects and engineers who had inherited a set of geometric principles, ruled surfaces, hyperbolic paraboloids, helicoids, conoids, and had spent decades trying to translate those principles from plaster models and broken fragments into working drawings that a stonemason could follow. For most of the building's history, that translation had been slow and partial, achieved through painstaking measurement of surviving models, through calculation done by hand, through the kind of geometric reasoning that a single skilled draftsman. The forms Gaudí had proposed were not simple curves that could be described by a single equation and cut with a template. They were doubly ruled surfaces, generated by straight lines moving along two guiding curves at once, mathematically elegant, but extraordinarily difficult to render at the full scale of a cathedral tower, using only pencil, compass, and patience. The introduction of computer-aided design changed the terms of that difficulty. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, the architects working on the temple began to model Gaudí's surfaces digitally, entering the same mathematical principles he had used, ruled geometry drawn from nature, from the branching of trees and the twisting of bones, into software capable of holding and manipulating them with a precision no hand could match. What had once required weeks of manual calculation to describe a single stone's precise angles could now be generated in minutes, and what had once been an educated approximation of Gaudí's intention could now be checked against the surviving plaster models with a rigor that gave the later architects a confidence their predecessors had not always possessed. The models were laser-scanned. The scattered fragments Gaudí had left behind, broken during the war and painstakingly reassembled afterward, were measured and remeasured, their curves extracted into digital form compared against the architect's early sketches, and used to reconstruct the underlying mathematical logic that had generated them in the first place. It was, in its way, a second act of recovery. Following the earlier physical reconstruction of the broken models, this one aimed not at restoring plaster and wire, but at restoring the invisible geometric reasoning that had produced them. What this digital reconstruction made possible, in turn, was manufacture at a scale and precision that the earlier decades of construction could never have achieved. Stone-cutting robotics, guided by the same three-dimensional models, could shape the elaborate hyperboloid vaults and the twisting columns of the nave with a consistency that no team of masons working freehand could reliably reproduce, especially across the many years and many different hands that any project of this duration must inevitably pass through. A block of stone could be roughed out by machine according to coordinates drawn directly from the digital model, its final surfaces finished by masons whose skill was now directed less toward improvisation than toward the fine judgment of surface and joint. A division of labor that would have seemed foreign to the stonecutters of the 1890s. But that allowed the building's most complex geometries, the branching columns that Gaudí had likened to a forest canopy, the twisting star-shaped skylights, to be produced with a fidelity to the original design that decades of hand labor alone had struggled to sustain. The architects who oversaw this transition spoke of it not as a departure from Gaudí's intention, but as its fulfillment, arguing that Gaudí himself had used the most advanced techniques available to him in his own time, the funicular models, the plaster casts, the early photography used to check his forms, and that continuing to use whatever tools the present era offered was simply an extension of the same working method, applied to a design whose full realization had always exceeded what any single generation of tools could achieve. It was through this combination of digital modeling and robotic stone cutting that the temple's central towers, the group rising above, the crossing of nave and transept, finally began to climb toward the heights Gaudí had proposed but never lived to see attempted. 6 towers were planned for this central cluster, 4 dedicated to the evangelists, 1 to the Virgin Mary, and at the center, taller than all the others, taller than any of the 18 towers the finished building would eventually carry, a tower dedicated to Jesus Christ, intended by Gaudí's original design to rise higher than any other structure in Barcelona, though he had specified, according to the accounts that survive, that it should remain slightly lower than Montjuic, the hill overlooking the city, out of what he considered a fitting humility before the natural landscape that had preceded any human construction upon it. The tower's planned height, drawn from Gaudí's surviving notes and the reconstructed models, would place its summit well above the loftiest cathedral spires of the medieval world, a fact the architects noted with the same measured tone that had characterized the project throughout its history. Offered less as boast than a simple consequence of following through at last on proportions the architect had established generations earlier, and that only the tools of a later century made possible to build. The engineering demands of that height were considerable and differed in kind from the challenges the temple's builders had faced in its first century of construction. A tower reaching so far above the surrounding city faced wind loads that the lower facades, however massive, had never needed to contend with in the same way, and the structural design of the central towers required extensive analysis of how the forms would behave under lateral pressure, how the ruled surfaces and the internal steel and concrete reinforcement concealed within the stone cladding would distribute that pressure down through the crossing piers and into the foundations below. Contemporary structural engineers ran computational models simulating wind behavior around the tower's complex, faceted surfaces, work that would have been simply unavailable to the builders of any earlier generation, and that gave the present team a degree of confidence that the tower could rise to its full planned height without compromising the stability that the entire temple depended upon. Alongside the question of wind stood the more immediate and human question of safety, for the temple had, by this point in its history, become something rare among active construction sites, a building visited daily by many thousands of people, even as cranes continued to lift stone above their heads and workers continued to labor on scaffolding within sight of the nave below. The architects and site managers were obliged to develop working methods that kept visitors separated from active construction zones through a combination of physical barriers, control routes, and careful scheduling of the heaviest lifting operations. 1. An arrangement that required constant coordination between the construction teams and the staff, managing the flow of tourists through the completed portions of the building. It was an unusual condition for any cathedral to find itself in, neither wholly a building site closed to the public, nor wholly a finished monument open without qualification, but something suspended between the two, and the temple's continuing custodians spoke of this dual identity worksite and sanctuary at once, who had always intended the building to be visited and prayed within long before its completion, believing that a work still visibly underway carried its own instruction for those who saw it, a reminder that faith, like architecture, was a labor pursued across a span. It was into this condition of ongoing, still unfinished labor that one of the temple's most significant modern milestones arrived. In November of 2010, when Pope Benedict XVI traveled to Barcelona to consecrate the basilica and declare it a minor basilica of the Catholic Church, a ceremony conducted inside a nave that was, by that point, substantially enclosed and roofed, its vaults completed, its stained glass largely in place, though the central towers, above, still stood incomplete, and the Western glory façade remained, as it remains still, largely unbuilt. The consecration did not mark the end of construction. Cranes continued to operate on the site in the years that followed, and masons continued their work on towers that would not be finished for years afterward. What the ceremony marked instead was the recognition, formalized at last by the church itself, that the building had become, whatever remained unbuilt above it, a functioning place of worship, a temple in active use rather than merely a monument awaiting completion. Visitors and architects alike noted the peculiarity of the moment, a consecration performed beneath scaffolding, a sacred rite conducted inside a building whose upper reaches were still measured in the vocabulary of construction schedules, and the temple's defenders took this peculiarity not as contradiction but as continuity, the same insistence Gaudí had held from the earliest years of his involvement, that the building's spiritual purpose did not wait upon its architectural completion, that a temple could be alive in every sense that mattered while its towers were still quite literally warned, in the process of rising into the sky above Barcelona. By the early years of the 21st century, this peculiarity had become something closer to a defining feature of the place than an embarrassment to be minimized. Visitors arriving at the temple's doors on an ordinary weekday morning might find themselves waiting behind a line of pilgrims who had traveled from other continents to attend a scheduled service, only to pass once inside beneath sections of ceiling still draped in protective netting. Past workers in hard hats moving quietly along, temporary walkways suspended high above the nave, the machinery of construction continuing its patient work, even as organ music rose through the same air that carried dust motes and the calls of foremen coordinating a crane's slow rotation somewhere beyond the clerestory windows. This was not, according to the accounts of those who managed the site, a temporary inconvenience to be tolerated until some distant date of completion. It was, and had been, for more than a century, simply how the building existed in the world. Mass had been celebrated within the basilica's walls long before its structure was anything approaching whole, a practice that traced back to the temple's earliest decades, when even the crypt, the first portion completed under the direction of the architect who preceded Gaudí, had served as a functioning place of worship while the ground above it remained an active excavation. Gaudí himself had attended services there, had understood the building not as a future monument awaiting its ribbon cutting, but as a sanctuary already fulfilling its purpose in whatever partial form it had achieved at any given moment. This understanding persisted through every subsequent decade of construction, through the years of war that halted work entirely, through the long post-war period of slow and uncertain progress, into the era of accelerated building that modern techniques and modern funding eventually made possible. Each stage of the temple's rise had been, simultaneously, a stage in its use, the sacred and the unfinished occupying the same physical space without apparent contradiction to those who came to pray within it. By the time Pope Benedict XVI consecrated the basilica in November of 2010, elevating it to the status of a minor basilica within the Catholic Church, the building had already been receiving worshippers and visitors for well over a century, changed little in the daily rhythm of the space. Masses continued to be held with the same regularity as before, now within a nave whose vaulting had been completed and whose columns in their branching multiplicity had taken on the fully realized form that Gaudí had first sketched in his studies of forest canopies and the load-bearing logic of trees. The comparison to a forest was not by this point merely a description offered by admiring visitors, but something closer to an architectural fact, the columns rising at varying angles from the floor, some inclined, some straight, dot-banning and redividing as they climbed toward the ceiling in a pattern that echoed the branching of trunks into limbs and limbs into smaller boughs, each column selected in its dimension and angle to carry the specific load it would bear at the height where it met the vault above. The effect, once the nave's upper reaches had finally been enclosed and the stained glass installed across the clerestory windows, was of walking into a stone woodland at some hour when the sun found its way through a dense and shifting canopy, and this was by design rather than accident. Gaudí, having spoken in terms nearly botanical when describing the structural logic of the interior, the columns as trunks, the ribs of the vaulting as branches, the small perforations that admitted light from above as the gaps between leaves through which sky might be glimpsed. The stained glass itself, largely completed across the later decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, under the direction of successive teams of artisans working from Gaudí's color studies and the structural parameters he had left behind. Reds and oranges and golds evoking sunrise and the nativity façade's themes of birth and beginning, while light entering from the west carried cooler tones, blues and greens, aligning with the passion façade's starker meditation on suffering and death. At certain hours, when the sun crossed the sky at the correct angle, the interior filled with shifting fields of colored light that moved slowly across the stone floor and up the trunks of the columns, a phenomenon that visitors frequently described in terms that bordered on the devotional, even when the visitors themselves professed no particular religious conviction. The sheer sensory experience of standing within a space where light itself seemed to have been given weight and color and a kind of unhurried motion. This interior, forest-like and luminous, had not existed in anything like its present form for most of the building's history. For decades, the nave stood open to the sky in places, its vaulting incomplete, its columns rising only partway to meet ribs that had not yet been extended to their final height. And the stained glass that now filled its windows with color was installed in stages across many years, different artisans and different decades, contributing sections that were only gradually unified into the coherent chromatic scheme that later visitors would experience as a single, deliberate composition. The completion of the roof over the nave, finally sealing the interior against the elements in a way it had not been sealed for the entirety of the 20th century, marked one of the quieter but more consequential milestones in the temple's long construction. Transforming a space that had functioned for generations as something between a church and an open-air worksite into an enclosed sanctuary whose acoustic and visual character could for the first time be fully appreciated as its designer had intended. The building's continued rise in these later decades depended on a source of funding that would have seemed almost unimaginable to those who first broke ground in the 1880s, when the temple was financed entirely through private donations solicited from the devout of Barcelona and beyond. Collected in small sums from parishioners and larger sums from wealthy patrons, a system that left construction perpetually vulnerable to the fluctuations of charitable giving, and that had, at more than one point in the temple's history, brought work to a near halt for want of funds. By the later 20th century and increasingly through the 21st, this precarious arrangement had been supplanted by a far steadier and far larger source of income. The admission fees paid by the millions of visitors who came each year to walk through the basilica's naves. Gas. The numbers involved by the early 21st century had grown to a scale that dwarfed anything the temple's original benefactors could have provided. Several million visitors annually paying for entry, the resulting revenue channeled directly into the ongoing costs of construction. Funding the stonemasons and engineers, and the increasingly sophisticated machinery required to complete the temple's most ambitious remaining elements, including the central towers that would, once finished, rise higher than any other structure in Barcelona. This transformation from a building sustained by the alms of the faithful to one sustained by the curiosity and admiration of tourists from every part of the world was rarely discussed as a matter of controversy among those who managed the temple's affairs, who tended to describe it instead as a fitting continuation of Gaudí's own resourcefulness. his willingness in his lifetime to seek funding wherever it might be found, to accept that a project of this scale and duration would require sources of support that shifted and evolved across the generations it took to complete. The visitors themselves, filing through the doors in numbers that required careful management of crowds and timed entry tickets, were not merely tolerated as a necessary inconvenience, but understood as participants, in their own way, in the same continuous act of construction and worship that had defined the building since its earliest years. Their admission fees, the modern equivalent of the coins once dropped into collection boxes by the working families of 19th century Barcelona. The sensory texture of the completed interior, by the time these later decades had brought the nave to something approaching its final form, offered visitors an experience that combined the solemnity of sacred space with the ongoing evidence of work still underway. The sound of footsteps and hushed conversation carried differently through a nave whose acoustics had been shaped, whether by design or by accident, into something that softened sharp noise into a kind of ambient murmur, while somewhere above or beyond the visible reach of the nave, the sounds of construction persisted, faint but present. A reminder carried on the air that the temple around which all this quiet awe circulated was not a finished object being merely preserved, but a living project still being built. Light moved through the glass in slow, shifting patterns across the hours of the day, warming and cooling as the sun traveled, and the stone columns rose overhead in their branching multiplicity, drawing the eye upward in the same manner a forest canopy might, toward vaults pierced with small openings that let fall additional threads of light from far above. To stand within this space, in these later decades of the temple's long construction, was to occupy a building that had never resolved the apparent tension between construction site and living church, and had in fact never sought to resolve it. Understanding instead that the two conditions were not opposites requiring reconciliation, but two expressions of a single ongoing act, the raising of a temple that was, in every year of its existence, already fully a temple, already receiving the prayers and wonder of those who passed beneath its columns. Even as cranes continued to turn somewhere above the highest visible stone. To understand what the Sagrada Familia represented and what it still represents, it helps to set it beside the other cathedrals of Europe that took not years but centuries to complete, structures whose builders understood from the outset that they were laying foundations for a future they would not see. Cologne Cathedral, begun in the middle years of the 13th century, stood for more than 300 years as an unfinished torso, its choir completed and consecrated, while its western towers remained stumps of medieval masonry rising only a modest distance above the roofline, surrounded by a crane that itself became, over generations, kind of local landmark, a fixture of the skyline, so enduring that it appeared in prints and paintings as though it were part of the design. Work on Cologne halted for reasons that were partly financial and partly a matter of changing taste. The Gothic style falling from favor as new fashions in architecture took hold across the German lands, and the cathedral sat in this suspended state through the Reformation, through wars, through the slow transformation of the city around it, until a revival of interest in medieval building in the 19th century brought fresh funds and fresh will, and the towers were finally completed in 1880, using, where possible, the original medieval plans, which had survived by a fortunate chance in an archive, so that the finished cathedral is in a real sense a medieval building executed with 19th century tools. The two eras joined across a gap of more than 600 years. Milan Cathedral offers a similar story of accumulated centuries, its construction beginning in the late 14th century and continuing through changes of style, changes of patron, changes of engineering fashion, well into the 19th century, with the final gate not completed until the 20th, so that the building seen today is not the product of one age but of five. Its façade, a kind of geological record of taste, with Gothic pinnacles beside neoclassical doorways. each generation adding what it believed the building required, each generation trusting that those who came after would not undo what had been placed, only add to it in the same patient spirit. Notre Dame de Paris, begun in the 12th century, took roughly 200 years to reach a form recognizable as complete, its builders working across generations who did not know one another, whose names in most cases were never recorded at all. Ordinary masons and carpenters whose labor is preserved only in the stone they shaped and not in any register of individual achievement, so that the cathedral stands, among other things, as a monument to collective anonymous effort sustained across a span of time longer than most human lives, longer than most dynasties. A project so large that it swallowed the careers of everyone who touched it and returned nothing to them but the work itself completed, imperfectly, by hands they never met. It is worth pausing on this point because it is easy, from a modern vantage, to imagine the medieval builder as somehow untroubled by the scale of the task, as though centuries meant less to people who lived shorter lives and measured time by different clocks. But the documentary record, where it survives, tells a more complicated story. Mason Guilds kept records of apprenticeship spanning generations precisely because they understood that a single lifetime would not see a cathedral through, and the passing of technique from master to apprentice was not a courtesy but a necessity built into the structure of the trade itself, an acknowledgement formalized in contract and custom. That no one who laid the first stone of a great church could reasonably expect to lay its last. This was the condition Gaudí inherited without needing to invent it, a condition as old as cathedral building itself, and one he spoke of directly in the plain words that survive from his conversations with visitors and colleagues when he observed that his client was in no hurry, meaning that whatever timeline the temple required, the temple would take, and that his own mortality was simply one term in an equation that had never, in the history of great church building, depended on any single life for its resolution. Where Gaudí departed from the medieval tradition was not in his patience, but in his geometry. This departure is worth dwelling on, because it is here that his true originality lies, more than in the ornament, more than in the surface decoration. The Gothic cathedral, for all its verticality and its light, is fundamentally an architecture of assembled parts: the pointed arch, the flying buttress, the rib vault, each a discrete structural solution to the problem of carrying weight and thrust, combined according to rules that, however sophisticated, remained essentially additive. One solved problem placed beside another. Gaudí, working through his hanging chain models and his studies of natural form, arrived at something different, a geometry in which the structural elements were not so much combined as grown, each column tilted and twisted to follow the actual lines of force running through it. Each vault shaped not by the imposition of an external decorative scheme, but by the internal logic of compression, finding its most efficient path downward, so that ornament and structure in the Sagrada Familia are frequently the same thing seen from different angles, the branching of a column into its capital echoing quite deliberately. The branching of a tree into its limbs, not as a decorative reference to nature, but as an engineering principle borrowed directly from it. This is why architects and structural engineers who came to study the temple in later decades, once the necessary computational tools existed to analyze what Gaudí had built almost entirely by intuition and physical modeling, found themselves consistently surprised by how closely his organic forms matched what modern stress analysis would recommend. As though he had reasoned his way through methods that appeared closer to sculpture than to mathematics, to solutions that a supercomputer would later confirm as structurally near optimal. Engineers working in reinforced concrete and thin shell construction in the 20th century, particularly in the post-war decades, when new materials made curved and cantilevered forms, newly practical, Look to Gaudi's ruled surfaces, his hyperboloids and paraboloids and helicoids, as an early demonstration that architecture need not choose between organic form and structural rigor, that the two could be, as he had shown decades before the vocabulary existed to describe his methods in formal mathematical terms, the same pursuit. The influence reached figures who never set foot in Barcelona in Gaudi's lifetime. Engineers studying thin concrete shells in Spain and Mexico, architects experimenting with tensile and compressive forms derived from physical models rather than drafted lines, all of them working, whether they credited it directly or not, in a tradition Gaudi had opened, a way of designing that treated the building not as an assembly of parts, but as a single continuous form shaped by the forces passing through it. Later still, in the era of computer-aided design, the temple offered something further, a body of drawings, models, and fragments, precise enough that its incomplete geometry could be reconstructed and extended using tools no 19th century mind could have anticipated. Tools that measured stress and load with a precision no plumb line or hanging chain could achieve, and yet arrived, again and again, at conclusions that validated rather than corrected what Gaudi had proposed by instinct and patient physical experiment. This is the peculiar modernity of the Sagrada Familia, a building conceived in the 1880s, in an age of gaslight and horse-drawn carts, whose final decades of construction have depended on three-dimensional printing, robotic stone cutting, and computer modeling software that did not exist, could not have existed. In any form Gaudi might have recognized, and yet the building these tools have produced is not a departure from his vision, but its fulfillment. The digital models built directly from his surviving plaster casts and fragmentary drawings extended along the same mathematical principles he used by hand. There is something almost vertiginous in this fact, properly considered. A structure begun with chisels and scaffolding assembled from timber, in a century that had not yet seen the automobile become common on the streets outside its doors, reaching its completion with methods drawn from aerospace engineering. The 19th century and the 21st meeting across a gap of more than 100 years in a single continuous structure that never stopped being built. Cologne had closed its gap of centuries by recovering old plans and finishing an old design with old methods dressed in new stone. Sagrada Familia closed its gap differently, carrying an old vision forward, not by imitating the tools of the 19th century, but by trusting that the underlying geometry, once correctly understood, would translate faithfully into whatever tools the future happened to provide, a wager that has, across the decades since Gaudi's death, been repeatedly confirmed. In this sense, the temple belongs to both traditions at once: the medieval patience of builders who worked without expectation of seeing the end, and a distinctly modern confidence that a rigorous enough idea, properly recorded, can survive the death of its author and be carried forward by strangers using instruments that author never imagined. The whole enterprise resting, as it always had, on the willingness of each generation to trust the plans and the reasoning left to them, and to add their span of years to a project that had never from its very first stone belonged to any one lifetime. For much of its history, the temple resisted any talk of an ending. Too many architects had come and gone. Too many decades had passed with the towers rising by a few meters and then pausing for years while funds were gathered for anyone connected with the work to speak with confidence about a final date. Yet in more recent years, as the central towers neared their full height and the last of the great structural questions were resolved, the language around the project began to shift. Board members and construction directors started to name a year. That year, spoken of quietly at first, and then more often as the work advanced, was chosen not for convenience but for meaning. It was set to mark 1 century since the death of Antoni Gaudi, so that the temple he had given the last years of his life to might, in some approximate sense, be brought to a state of completion within 100 years of his passing. The symbolism of that timing was not lost on anyone who had followed the temple's long history. A building that had once seemed destined to remain forever unfinished, a project so vast that its own architect had accepted he would not live to see it done, was now being spoken of in terms of a single symbolic year, as though the child of that vision might finally, after a century of waiting, mature and stand ready. It is worth being careful about what completion actually meant in this context, because a temple raised over so many generations does not simply switch on a given morning from unfinished to finished. Some of the most visible remaining work concerned the towers themselves. Of the 18 spires envisioned in Gaudi's design, dedicated to the 4 evangelists, the 12 apostles, the Virgin Mary, and tallest of all, Jesus Christ, several remained incomplete even as the 21st century advanced. The Tower of the Virgin Mary rose first among the last additions, its star-topped pinnacle catching the Barcelona light in a way that echoed, deliberately, the star that Gaudí had imagined shining over the whole composition. Above it, still under construction, rose the central tower dedicated to Christ, designed to surpass every other spire on the building and by intention to remain lower than the hill of Montjuic that overlooks the city, a restraint Gaudí himself had insisted upon, believing that no work of human hands should rise higher than what he considered God's own creation. The completion of this central tower, with its enormous cross-shaped finial, was understood by everyone involved to be the single most anticipated event remaining in the temple's long construction, a moment that would more than any other mark the visual completion of the exterior silhouette that had haunted architectural drawings and photographs for more than a century. Beyond the towers lay the Matter of the Glory façade, the third and largest of the temple's 3 great entrances, and by far the most delayed. Where the Nativity façade had been carved under Gaudí's own direction and the Passion façade completed decades later, according to his surviving sketches, the Glory façade had barely been begun during his lifetime beyond a few foundational elements and scattered notes. It was intended, according to what evidence survives, to be the principal entrance of the temple dedicated to the final judgment, death and resurrection. A façade meant to overwhelm visitors with its scale and symbolic weight before they passed into the nave itself. Its construction required not only enormous sculptural and structural work, but also the demolition or rerouting of an existing city street that ran directly across the space the façade needed to occupy, a matter that had entangled the project in municipal negotiations, since it meant relocating families and reworking a piece of the surrounding neighborhood that had grown up around the temple during the long decades of its construction. The resolution of that street and the careful planning of the plaza that would eventually front the completed façade became one of the quieter but most consequential threads of the project's final phase, a reminder that finishing a temple of this scale meant finishing not only stone and glass but also the civic fabric around it. As the completion date drew nearer in public conversation, so too did a set of debates that had, in truth, accompanied the temple for its entire history, but which sharpened considerably as the finish line came into view. These debates centered on a single difficult question: how much of what remained to be built could honestly be called Gaudí's own design, and how much was, by necessity, the interpretation of those who came after him. The destruction of his workshop during the civil conflict of the 1930s had taken with it a significant portion of his working models, his notes, and the plaster studies from which so much of his intended design had to be reconstructed. What survived was pieced together over decades by architects, historians, and archivists working with fragments, photographs taken before the destruction, and the testimony of collaborators who had worked alongside him and remembered, however imperfectly, what he had described. Every subsequent architect who took up responsibility for the project inherited not a complete blueprint, but an evolving partial reconstruction, one that had to be extended through calculation, analogy, and informed judgment wherever the documentary record fell silent. This reality placed later architects and historians in a position that Gaudí himself, given his method of working through models rather than fixed drawings, might have found familiar. And yet it also opened the project to sustained scholarly and public disagreement. Some architectural historians argued that the temple being built in its final decades, however carefully reasoned, could no longer be considered purely Gaudí's work, since so many decisions, particularly regarding the glory façade, rested on interpretation rather than direct instruction. Others countered that Gaudí's design method had always anticipated collaborative extension, that his own drawings explicitly deferred detail to future builders working from his established principles of structure and proportion, and that continuing the work using his geometric logic and his stated symbolic intentions was the most faithful way to honor him. More faithful, in fact, than halting construction at the point where his personal hand had last touched it. This disagreement was never resolved into a single consensus, and it remains even now a live conversation among architects, art historians, and members of the public who visit the temple, some of whom have voiced discomfort at the idea of a building attributed so completely to one visionary being finished in its final stages, by architects and engineers using tools he never possessed, including computer modeling and stress analysis software applied to forms he had once worked out through hanging chains and mirrored plaster. To address these questions as responsibly as possible, the project maintained and continues to maintain a substantial and ongoing program of archival research. Teams of architects and historians work through the surviving fragments of Gaudí's models, cross-referencing early photographs, correspondence, and the recollections passed down through generations of workshop staff attempting to verify wherever the evidence allows. Exactly how a given tower or ornament was meant to appear, and to distinguish those elements that rest on solid documentary ground from those that must be extrapolated using his broader design principles. This work is slow and deliberately unglamorous, conducted largely away from the tourists who fill the nave each day, in archives and study rooms where fragments of plaster and faded photographic plates are compared against modern structural drawings. It is, in its way, a continuation of the same patient discipline that shaped every earlier phase of the temple's construction, a willingness to move only as fast as the evidence permits, and to accept incomplete certainty rather than invent a confidence the historical record does not support. There is something quietly fitting in the fact that a project defined for so long by patient generational labor should, in its final approach to completion, be defined by the same patience turned toward questions of authenticity and memory. For nearly a century and a half, the temple has asked each generation that touched it to trust the reasoning of those who came before, to add their span of years and their particular skills to a structure whose true completion. Now, with a symbolic date finally within sight, that same trust is being tested in a different way, not simply whether the towers can be raised and the facade carved, but whether the meaning of the whole can still be called, honestly, the vision of the man who began it. The strange patience required of everyone connected with the temple today is not so different from the patience required of the first stonemasons who laid its foundations without any expectation of an ending. Only now the waiting is not for scaffolding to rise, but for a set of overlapping questions, historical, architectural, and spiritual, to settle into something the coming generations can accept as a true and honorable finish to a work that has never, at any point in its long life, belonged entirely to the present moment. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over the temple in the earliest hours of the morning, before the buses arrive and before the plazas fill with the murmur of visitors trying to find the correct entrance. In that stillness, if the season is right and the sky is clear, the first light of day crosses the nativity facade before it touches anything else on the street, catching the carved figures of the shepherds and the animals and the small stone birds that Gaudí once insisted be shaped from casts of real creatures, so that even the smallest ornament would carry the truth of something that had actually lived. The light moves slowly across the sculpted surface, finding the folds of stone drapery, the recessed doorways, the climbing towers with their perforated tips, and for a few minutes the whole facade seems less like a building than like something that has grown there gradually, the way coral grows, layer upon layer, until it becomes a shape too intricate to have been planned by any single mind working alone. And yet it was planned, at least in its first suggestion, by a young man not yet 30, who could not have known that the modest chapel he was asked to help complete would become, over the following century and beyond, one of the most studied and most argued over religious buildings in the world. It is worth returning in this final accounting to how far the temple has traveled from where it began. Francisco de Paula del Villar conceived a church that, by the standards of what eventually rose on the site, would be considered restrained. A neo-Gothic structure, dignified and orderly, of the kind that dotted the cities of 19th century Europe without asking to be remembered as singular. Villar's plans were sound and unremarkable, drawn according to the conventions he had learned and practiced faithfully throughout his career. Had his design gone forward without interruption, Barcelona would likely possess today a solid and handsome parish church, respected locally, visited occasionally by those with a particular interest in the architecture of its era, but almost certainly not the subject of international pilgrimage, and structural debate that the temple has become. That transformation depended entirely on the dispute over the crypt vaulting that led Villar to resign, and on the decision of the governing board to hand the commission to a young architect whose early work had given little indication of the direction his imagination would eventually take. It is one of the quieter ironies in the story of the temple that its most famous and least anticipated feature, the very thing that makes it unlike any other cathedral raised in the modern era, exists only because of an administrative disagreement over how deep a foundation should run and what stone should support it. From that modest and almost accidental beginning, the temple passed through the hands of a single architect for more than 40 years, and in that time it became something closer to a personal cosmology than a conventional commission. Gaudí did not simply decorate Villar's plan, he replaced its logic entirely, drawing on the forms he had observed in the natural world, the geometry of trees and bones and shells, and translating that geometry into columns that branched like living wood and vaults that curved like the inside of a seed pod. Extended the building's ambition from a single planned entrance to 3 great facades, each intended to render a different chapter of a shared story in stone. And he built, in the workshop beside the site, a small factory of plaster models and hanging chain studies meant to carry his intentions forward long after his own hands could no longer shape them. That his hands did in fact stop far sooner than anyone expected, on a spring evening in 1926, only sharpened the importance of the models he left behind, and it placed upon everyone who came after him a burden that few architects in history have ever had to carry, the burden of finishing another man's vision using only fragments of his brain. Gaudí's intended method, reconstructed patiently out of plaster shards and photographs, and the memory of those who had worked at his side. The uncertain years that followed, the destruction of the workshop during the civil conflict of the 1930s, the slow and contested reconstruction of the plans, the decades of argument over whether continuation honored or betrayed the original design, are themselves now part of the temple's history in a way that cannot be separated from its stones. The building carries within it not only the ambition of its founding architect, but the scars and decisions of everyone who worked to keep his ambition alive after he was gone, including those such as Sabirix, who chose deliberately to diverge from Gaudi's softened forms and speak in a harsher and more angular voice on the Passion facade, arguing that a building meant to express suffering should not always be beautiful. That disagreement, still unresolved among historians and visitors alike, is not a flaw in the temple's story, but very much a part of it. Evidence that the building has never stopped being a site of genuine debate about how sacred architecture should look and what it owes to the intentions of a single, long-departed man. What the temple means beyond its walls is harder to state plainly than what it is made of or how it was built, but something can still be said with confidence. It stands as one of the clearest surviving demonstrations that devotion and craft, sustained across generations, can produce a structure whose scale exceeds any single lifetime's capacity to complete it, and that such a structure need not be diminished by its unfinished state. For most of its existence, the temple has been a construction site as much as a place of worship, and this has not prevented it from becoming, for millions of visitors and thousands of Barcelona residents, a genuine touchstone of civic identity and spiritual reflection. It has been called at various points in its long life an act of extraordinary faith, an act of extraordinary vanity, an unfinished symphony in stone, and simply a very large and very strange building that refuses to be finished on any predictable schedule. All of these descriptions carry some truth. The temple has always resisted easy summary, and it seems likely, as the towers near their planned completion in the coming years, that it will continue to resist easy summary even once the scaffolding finally comes down and the cranes are removed from the skyline they have occupied for so long that many residents of the city have never known Barcelona without them. There is something quietly moving in the fact that the towers still rise even now, more than a century after ground was first disturbed for the crypt, and that the same morning light which once fell across bare foundations and half-formed walls now falls across finished spires standing beside towers still wrapped in construction netting, still being lifted stone by stone toward their intended height. Visitors walking the plaza today can look up and see, in a single glance, both the temple's past and its unfinished future. The completed nativity facade, weathered gently by more than a century of sun and rain, standing beside newer stone barely a decade old, pale and unweathered, waiting for the same slow accumulation of years to soften its edges and blend it into the whole. Cranes turn slowly above this juxtaposition, lowering sections of tower into place with the same careful patience that guided the earliest stonemasons, and the sound of construction, the grinding of machinery, and the calls of workers coordinating a lift mixes with the quieter sound of visitors speaking in hushed voices as they move through the completed portions of the nave, taking in a ceiling of stone branches that filters colored light across the floor, exactly as Gaudí intended. It is tempting, faced with a building this unusual, to search for a tidy lesson, some single sentence that explains what the temple is meant to teach. But perhaps the more honest reflection is simply this: that some structures are conceived not to be finished within the lifetime of those who begin them, and that the choice to keep building anyway generation after generation, funded not by government treasury but by the accumulated donations of visitors and the faithful, represents a particular kind of patience that has grown rarer as the pace of the modern world has quickened. The temple asks something of everyone who contributes to it, whether stonemason, architect, donor, or simply a visitor who purchases a ticket at the door, and that something is trust that the work begun by others will be carried forward faithfully by those who come after, even when the original vision can only be reconstructed from fragments. Even when the final appearance remains in certain details a matter of informed judgment rather than certain knowledge. The cranes will not turn forever. Estimates place the completion of the central towers within the coming years, a date that has shifted before and may shift again, but which no longer feels as distant or as improbable as it once did. When the last stone is finally set and the last crane is lowered from the skyline, the temple will complete a journey that began with a modest neo-Gothic plan and passed through the hands of a visionary architect, through war and interruption, through decades of careful reconstruction, guided by broken plaster models, and through the quiet, accumulated labor of workers whose names, in most cases, history has not preserved. It will stand, finally finished, as a monument not only to the faith and imagination of the man most closely associated with it, but to every generation that chose, without certainty of seeing the result, to keep building anyway. If there is a channel worth returning to, for stories like this one, for the long histories of structures raised slowly against doubt and difficulty, it will be here, waiting quietly. Whenever you would like to find it again, rest well